Let me ask, by way of recommendations, I think a lot of people are curious about this kind of stuff. What 3 books, technical or fiction or philosophical or anything really, had an impact on your life and or you would recommend, besides, of course, your book?
There's one book I wish everyone could read. I'm not sure if you've read it. It's actually a children's book, like a young adult book. Mm-hmm. It's called The Giver.
Yes,
and it is a book that kids in school read now. And I only
sorry, that's wow. Because I've sorry, that caught me off guard. So when I first came to this country, I didn't speak much. It's really what made me. It had a profound impact on my life,
wow.
and at a really important moment because they give it to kids. Like I think
it's like middle school, I think, or maybe elementary,
something like that.
Well, I'm so surprised you've even heard of this book.
Yeah,
wow,
so they give it, but like it's the value of giving the right book to a person at the right time.
Wow.
I was because it's very accessible.
Do we want to share what the story is without spoiling it?
Yeah, you can without spoiling, right?
It follows this boy in this very utopic society that's like perfect. It's been all clean cut and made perfect, actually. Mm-hmm. And as he kind of comes of age, he starts realizing something's wrong with his world. And so it's part of that question, are we going to evolve as this isn't what's there, but it made me wonder, are we evolving to a better place? Is there a day when we can eliminate, poverty and hunger and crime and sickness? In this book, they pretty much have in the society that the boy's in. And sort of follows him, and he becomes the chosen one to be like a receiver. The giver's the old wise man who retains some of the harshness of the outside world so that he can advise the people. As the sort of boy comes of age and is chosen for this special role, he finds the world isn't what he expects. And I don't know about you, but it was so profound for me because it jolts you out of reality. It's like, oh my God, what am I doing here? I'm just going with the flow with my society. How do I think outside the box and the confines of my society, which surely carries negative things with it that we don't realize today?
Yeah, and also, and the flip side of that is, if you do take a step outside the box on occasion, what's the psychological burden of that? Like, is that a step you want to take? Is that the journey you want to take? What is that life like?
I don't know. I felt like from the book, you have to take it. I found from the book. I never thought, like, now that you're saying it, I see what you're saying. The burden is huge, but I always felt like the answer is yes. You absolutely want to know what's outside, but you can't do that if it's hard to be objective about your own reality.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very human instinct, but it also, the book kind of shows that it has an effect on you. And it's a really interesting question about our society taking a step out.
It's by Lois Lowry, I think is how you pronounce it. I really do hope everyone can read it. And it is a young adult book, but it's incredibly, I'm really glad. I only read it because my kids got it for school. I just thought, okay, well, why don't I just see what this is about? And wow.
Yeah. I think it's also the value of education. I think, I'm surprised you mentioned it. I've never really mentioned to anybody. I'm sure a lot of people had the similar experience like me, and maybe.
It's a generational thing though, because the book came out, I think, in the 90s. So if you're older than like me, that book didn't exist when we were in middle school. So I just do think a lot of people won't have heard of it.
But it's an interesting question of like those books. I mean, I'm reminded often, I suppose the same is true as with other subjects, but books are special at early age, like middle school, maybe early high school. Those can change like the direction of your life. And also certainly teachers. They can change completely the direction of their life. There's so many stories about teachers of mathematics, teachers of physics, of any kind of subjects, basically changing the direction of a human's life. That's like, not to get on the whole, like almost like a political thing, but we undervalue teachers. It's a special position that they hold.
So true, yeah. Well, I do have two other things. One is something I came across just a few days ago, actually. It's actually a film called Picture a Scientist. And when you picture a scientist, you probably don't picture the women and women of color in this film. And it is a way to get outside your box. I really think everyone interested in science, even just peripherally, should watch this because it is shocking and sobering at the same time. And it talks about how Well, I think one of the messages across is, we really are like, I don't know if we're hardwired to just like people like ourselves, but we're excluding a lot of people and therefore a lot of great ideas by not being able to think outside of how we're all stereotyping each other. So it's hard to kind of convey that. And you can just say, oh yeah, I want to be more diverse. I want to be more open. But it's a nearly impossible problem to solve. And the movie really helps open people's eyes to it. This book I put third because unlike The Giver, people may not want to read it. It's not as relevant. But when I was in my early 20s, I went to this like 800 people large conference called run by the Wilderness Canoe Association in my hometown of Toronto. And there was a family friend there who I met, and he said, read this book, it'll change your life. And it actually changed my life. And it was a book called Sleeping Island by an author, P.G. Downs, who just coincidentally lived in this area, lived in the Boston area. And he was a teacher, I think at a private school. And every summer he would go to Canada with a canoe, often by himself. And he wrote this book maybe in the 40s or 50s about a trip he took in the late 1930s. And I was just shocked that even at that time, although that was a long time ago, there were large parts of Canada that were untouched by white people. Wow. And he went up there and interacted like with the natives. He called the book, it had a subtitle that was called, there's something like Journey in the Barren Lands. And when you go up north in Canada, you pass the tree line. Just like on a mountain, if you hike up a mountain, you get so far north there aren't any trees. And he wrote eloquently about the land and about being out there. There weren't even any maps of the region, like in that time. And I just thought to myself, wow, like that you could just take the summer off and explore by canoe and go and see what's out there. And it led to me just doing that very thing. Of course, it's different now, but going out to where the road ends and putting the canoe in the water and we had to have a plan. We didn't just explore, but go down this rivers with rapids and travel over lakes and portages and just really live.
So just really explore. Screw it. That doesn't explore, like it doesn't.
Explore. Just use from a topographical map from the library. In those days, there were scary elements out of it, but part of the excitement or the joy or the desire was to be scared. Was to go out there and live on the edge
and persevere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there 3 books, technical fiction or philosophical, that had an impact on you? Like, is there books that you kind of return to that you enjoy and that had, you find profound in some way?
I would say like probably the thing I read is in one of Emerson's essays that I read at a, point in my life where I needed that type of thing. And I read Self-Reliance, and, he's got a ton of good essays, but I thought Self-Reliance was probably the most impactful to me. I've read later in life like a handful of, existential authors, and they're all great. But at the time, a lot of it has to do with timing. And when I read Self-Reliance and it was about the individual, that was really good. And it was impactful. There's also a book called Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach, I think. And it's kind of along the same lines. It's about this seagull who, wants to break conformity and learn to fly and do all these other great things. And so it's a very short read. So if people are interested in that, that's good. The book, which I was lucky enough to read before the movie ever even came out, which is just a pleasure of mine, was American Psycho. Just from a writing standpoint, I found that the writing was awesome. Bret Easton Ellis is the author of that and several other books who have like intertwining characters. He's a New England prep school guy, and so a lot of like the stories and a lot of the visuals rang true for me. And anyone who can write 4 pages of prose on like a Huey Lewis album, I mean, kudos to you. And I also would say no one will do this, but I would at some point read as much of one of the big 3 religious texts as possible. It really gives you perspective. There's so many overlapping stories in religious texts, and then the way that they're written gives you a unique perspective on different people throughout the world. And if you're a Roman Catholic, maybe don't read the Bible, read one of the other texts, and that would be an interesting take. But
I'm embarrassed to say that, first of all, I've never read the Bible, which is embarrassing to say. It's like I read a bunch of stuff about the Bible, not the Bible itself. And the same, not equating them, but I haven't read Marx directly. I haven't read Mein Kampf by Hitler directly. And it feels like sometimes, because you think like it's better to read stuff about the books, but ultimately you want, because like the analysis will be better in the texts that followed it, but there's value to actually reading like the actual words. There's power in the words that there's a reason why like the Bible is one of the most impactful books ever, and it's in those words, and it's of value to return to those words.
The Communist Manifesto is truly frightening if you read it in like modern context.
It's worth reading.
Yeah.
It's worth reading.
Yeah.
And so is Mein Kampf. Not obviously, it's not obvious, but it is not very well written. But all the ideas that led to the evil that is Hitler are all in there, which is fascinating to think about, because probably some of the world leaders at the time should have probably read the books. He outlined everything he's going to do. It seems like you have an interesting, rich, complex trajectory through life in terms of your journey of ideas. So it's interesting to ask what books, technical, fiction, philosophical, books, ideas, people had a transformative effect. Books are most interesting because maybe people could also read those books and see if they could be inspired as well.
Yeah, luckily you asked books and not singular book. It's very hard, and I try to pin down one book.
Yeah.
And I can do that at the end. So the books which were most transformative for me, or which I can most highly recommend to people interested in AI.
Both, perhaps.
Both. I would always start with Russell and Norvig, Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. That's the AI Bible. It's an amazing book. It's very broad. It covers, all approaches to AI. And even if you focused on one approach, I think that is the minimum you should know about the other approaches out there. So that should be your first book.
4th edition should be coming out soon.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
There's a deep learning chapter now, so there must be. Written by Ian Goodfellow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the next book I would recommend, the Reinforcement Learning book by Sutton and Bartow. That's a beautiful book. If there's any problem with the book, it makes RL feel and look much easier than it actually is. It's a very gentle book. It's very nice to read. The exercises to do, you can very quickly, get some RL systems to run, on very toy problems, but it's a lot of fun. And in a couple of days, you feel, you know what RL is about, but it's much harder than the book.
Yeah. Come on now. It's an awesome book.
Yeah. No, it is. Yeah. And maybe, there's so many books out there. If you like the information theoretic approach, then there's Kolmogorov Complexity by Leon Vitani, but probably, some short article is enough. You don't need to read the whole book, but it's a great book. And if you have to mention one all-time favorite book, so different flavor, that's a book which is used in the International Baccalaureate for high school students in several countries. That's from Nicholas Altjen, Theory of Knowledge, 2nd edition, or first, not the third, please. The third one, they took out all the fun.
Okay.
This asks all the interesting, or to me, interesting philosophical questions about how we acquire knowledge from all perspectives, from math, from art, from physics, and ask how can we know anything. And the book is called Theory of Knowledge.
From which it's almost like a philosophical exploration of how we get knowledge from anything.
Yes, yeah. Can religion tell us, about something about the world? Can science tell us something about the world? Can mathematics, or is it just playing with symbols? And it's open-ended questions. And it's for high school students, so they have then resources from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and from Star Wars and The Chicken Crossed the Road. Yeah, and it's fun to read, but it's also quite deep.
We mentioned so many brilliant books and philosophers, but it'd be nice to sort of in a focused way try to see if we can get some recommendations from you. So what 3 books, technical or fiction or philosophical, had a
Oh man,
Big. This is the worst
awesome.
question.
Well,
had a big
you know
impact
what?
in your life, and you would recommend.
Spent 4 hours driving here, perseverating about that. Everything else you sent me.
That's fine. Yeah.
And I skimmed it, and I'm like, I don't want to look at it because I want us to talk.
Yeah.
The ones in blue, I'm like, all right. And you know, I've already said that I've found Becker's work, and I put The Denial of Death out there.
Is that his best? Sorry, on a small tangent. Yeah. Is there other books of his?
See if I could have this count as one. The Birth and Death of Meaning, The Denial of Death, and Escape from Evil are 3 books of Ernest Becker's that I believe to all be profound.
In a little sort of brief dance around topics. I've only read Denial of Death. Like, how do those books connect in your?
Yeah, nice. So the Birth and Death of Meaning is where Becker situates his thinking in more of an evolutionary foundation. So I like that for that reason. Escape from Evil is where he applies the ideas in the Denial of Death more directly to economic matters and to inequality, and also to our inability to peacefully coexist with other folks who don't share our beliefs. So I would put Ernest Becker out there as one. I also like novels a lot. And here I was like, God damn it, no matter what I say, I'm going to be like, yes, but.
The existentialists, do you like all those folks? Camus? Do you like that literary existentialism?
I do, but I mean, you know, I've read all those books. I will tell you the last line of The Plague: we learn in times of pestilence that there's more to admire in men than to despise. And I love that.
Yeah. Plague's such a, I don't know. I find The Plague is a brilliant book.
Me too.
Before The Plague has come to us in 2020, it was just such a good book.
So,
a book about love,
but I'll toss a one that may be less known to folks. I'm enamored with a novel by a woman named Carson McCullers, written in 1953, called Clock Without Hands. And I find it a brilliant literary depiction of many of the ideas that we have spoken about.
Fiction,
yeah.
What kind of ideas are we talking about?
All of the existential ideas that we have encountered today, but in the context of a story of someone who finds out that he is terminally ill. It's set in the South in the heyday of like segregation. So there's a lot of social issues, a lot of existential issues, but it's basically a fictional account of someone who finds out that they're terminally ill and who reacts originally as you might expect anyone, becomes more hostile to people who are different, like petty and stupid, denies that anything's happening. But as the book goes on and he comes more to terms with his own mortality, it ends lovingly. And back to your idea about, love being incredibly potent.
That's the nice thing, as you mentioned before with Heidegger. I really like that idea, and I've seen that in people who are terminally ill, is they bring, the idea of death becomes current.
Yes.
It becomes like a thing. I could die. I really like that idea. I can die not just tomorrow, but like now. Now.
Yeah.
That's a really useful. I don't even know. I think I've been too afraid to even think about that. Like
I have.
Like sit here and think like in 5 minutes.
Exactly.
It's over.
Yeah.
This is it. In 5 minutes, it's over.
Yeah. So that would be my most recent addition, as I really am struck by Heidegger
So would you recommend that?
Well, okay. Well, if you have a few years.
I remember I tuned out Being in Time. I was like, I tried to read it. I was like, that's it.
Look, it took me 40 years to read Ulysses. I could not get past the first 5 pages. And it took me 40 years to read Being in Time. It's a slog.
Yeah.
And
well, I took a James Joyce course in college. So I even I guess read parts of Finnegan's Wake.
No way.
But like, there's a difference between reading and like. Yeah. I don't think I understood anything. I like his short stories on the dead. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I like Faulkner. Absalom. Absalom is a fine book.
But would you? Is there something Heidegger connected in a book you would recommend or no?
No, so maybe I got to abandon him. I mean, Being in Time is awesome. But here's an interesting thing, and not to get all academic-y, but there's 2 parts to it, and most philosophers are preoccupied with the first part. It's in the second part where he gets into all the flight from death stuff and this idea of a turning, and philosophers don't like that. And I'm like, this is where he's starting to
really shine
for me. So
yeah. All right, that's a beautiful set of books. All that to say, are you still avoiding the 3 books question? Is there something on audiobook that you can recommend?
Oh, I've read a lot of really fun stuff. In terms of books that I find myself thinking back on that I read a while ago, like that have stood the test of time to some degree, I find myself thinking of Program or Be Programmed a lot by Douglas Rushkoff, which it basically put out the premise that we all need to become programmers in one form or another. And it was in analogy to once upon a time, we all had to become readers. We had to become literate. And there was a time before that when not everybody was literate. But once literacy was possible, the people who were literate had more of a say in society than the people who weren't. And so we made a big effort to get everybody up to speed. And now it's not 100% universal, but it's quite widespread. Like the assumption is generally that people can read. The analogy that he makes is that programming is a similar kind of thing, that we need to have a say in, right? So being a reader, being literate, being a reader means you can receive all this information, but you don't get to put it out there. Mm-hmm. And programming is the way that we get to put it out there. And that was the argument they made. I think he specifically has now backed away from this idea. He doesn't think it's happening quite this way. And that might be true that society didn't sort of play forward quite that way. But I still believe in the premise. I still believe that at some point the relationship that we have to these machines and these networks has to be one of each individual has the wherewithal to make the machines help them do the things that person wants done. And as software people, we know how to do that. And when we have a problem, we're like, okay, well, I'll hack up a Perl script or something and make it so. If we lived in a world where everybody could do that, that would be a better world. And computers would have, I think, less sway over us. And other people's software would have less sway over us as a group.
Yeah, in some sense, software engineering, programming is power.
Programming is power. Right. It's like magic. It's like magic spells. And it's not out of reach of everyone. But at the moment, it's just a sliver of the population who can commune with machines in this way. So I don't know. So that book had a big impact on me. Currently, I'm reading The Alignment Problem, actually, by Brian Christian. So I don't know if you've seen this out there yet.
Is it similar to Stuart Russell's work with the control problem?
It's in that same general neighborhood. I mean, they have different emphases that they're concentrating on. I think Stuart's book did a remarkably good job, just a celebratory good job at describing AI technology and sort of how it works. I thought that was great. It was really cool to see that in a book.
Yeah, I think he has some experience writing some books.
That's probably a possible thing. He's maybe thought a thing or two about how to explain AI to people. Yeah, that's a really good point. This book so far has been remarkably good at telling the story of the recent history of some of the things that have happened. I'm in the first third. He said the book is in 3/3. The first third is essentially AI fairness and implications of AI on society that we're seeing right now, and that's been great. I mean, he's telling the stories really well. He went out and talked to the frontline people whose names are associated with some of these ideas, and it's been terrific. He says the second half of the book is on reinforcement learning, so maybe that'll be fun. And then the third is on this superintelligence alignment problem, and I suspect that part will be less fun for me to read.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem to talk about. I find it to be the most interesting, just like thinking about whether we live in a simulation or not, as a thought experiment to think about our own existence. So in the same way, talking about alignment problem with AGI is a good way to think, similar to like the trolley problem with autonomous vehicles. It's a useless thing for engineering, but it's a nice little thought experiment for actually thinking about what are like our own human ethical systems, our moral systems to by thinking how we engineer these things, you start to understand yourself.
So sci-fi can be good at that too. So one sci-fi book to recommend is Exhalations by Ted Chiang, a bunch of short stories. This Ted Chiang is the guy who wrote the short story that became the movie Arrival. And all of his stories, just from he was a computer scientist, actually he studied at Brown. They all have this sort of really insightful bit of science or computer science that drives them. And so it's just a romp, right? To just like, he creates these artificial worlds with these, by extrapolating on these ideas that we know about, but hadn't really thought through to this kind of conclusion. And so his stuff it's really fun to read. It's mind warping.
To them.
Since you mentioned books, I don't know if you can answer this question, but people love it when I ask it, which is, are there books, technical fiction or philosophical, that you enjoyed or had an impact on your life that you would recommend? You already mentioned Dune, like Dune. all of the Dune.
All of the Dune. The second one was probably the weakest, but anyway, so yeah, all of the Dune is good.
I mean, yeah. Can you just slow little tangent on that? Is how many Dune books are there? Like, do you recommend people start with the first one if that was?
Yeah, you kind of have to read them all. I mean, it is a complete story, right? So you start with the first one. You got to read all of them.
So it's not like a tree, like that, like a creation of like the universe that you just should go in sequence.
You should go in sequence. Yeah, it's kind of a chronological storyline. There's 6 books in all. Then there's like many kind of offshoot books that were written by Frank Herbert's son, but those are not as good, so you don't have to bother with those.
Shots fired. Okay.
Shots fired.
Okay.
But the main sequence is good. So what are some other books? Maybe there's a few. So I don't know that like I would say there's a book that kind of, I don't know, turned my life around or anything like that. But here's a couple that are.
So I think a lot of people look at a brilliant person such as yourself and are curious about the intellectual journey they've took. Is there maybe 3 books, technical, fiction, philosophical, that had a big impact on your life that you would recommend perhaps others reading?
Yeah. So I actually didn't read that much as a kid, but I read fairly voraciously now. There are some recent books that, if you're interested in this kind of topic, like AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee is just a fantastic read. You must read that. Yuval Harari is just, I think that can open your mind.
Sapiens
is the first one. Homo Deus is the second. Yeah. We mentioned The Black Swan by Taleb. I think that's a good sort of mind opener. I actually, so there's maybe a more controversial recommendation I could give.
Great.
Well,
we love controversy.
In some sense, it's so classical it might surprise you. But I actually recently read Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book. Not so long. It was a while ago. But some people hate that book. I loved it. I think we're in this time right now where boy, we're just inundated with research papers that you could read on archive with limited peer review and just this wealth of information. I don't know. I think the passion of what you can get out of a book, a really good book or a really good paper, if you find it, the attitude, the realization that you're only going to find a few that really are worth all your time. But then once you find them, you should just dig in and understand it very deeply, and it's worth, marking it up and having the hard copy, writing in the side notes, side margins. I think that was really it. I read it at the right time where I was just feeling just overwhelmed with really low quality stuff, I guess. And similarly, I'm giving more than 3 now. I'm sorry if I've exceeded my quota.
But on that topic, just real quick, is so basically finding a few companions to keep for the rest of your life in terms of papers and books and so on. And those are the ones, like not doing, FOMO, fear of missing out, constantly trying to update yourself, but really deeply making a life journey of studying a particular paper, essentially, a set of papers.
Yeah, I think when you really find something which a book that resonates with you might not be the same book that resonates with me, but when you really find one that resonates with you, I think the dialogue that happens, and that's what I loved that Adler was saying. I think Socrates and Plato say the written word is never going to capture the beauty of dialogue, right? But Adler says no. A really good book is a dialogue between you and the author, and it crosses time and space. And I don't know. I think it's a very romantic. There's a bunch of like specific advice which you can just gloss over, but the romantic view of how to read and really appreciate it is so good.
Yeah.
And similarly, teaching. I thought a lot about teaching, and so Isaac Asimov, great science fiction writer, has also actually spent a lot of his career writing nonfiction, right? His memoir is fantastic. He was passionate about explaining things, right? He wrote all kinds of books on all kinds of topics in science. He was known as the great explainer. And I do really resonate with his style and just his way of talking about, by communicating and explaining to something is really the way that you learn something. I think about problems very differently because of the way I've been given the opportunity to teach them at MIT and have questions asked, the fear of the lecture, the experience of the lecture and the questions I get and the interactions just forces me to be rock solid on these ideas in a way that if I didn't have that, I don't know, I would be in a different intellectual space. Also,
video, does that scare you that your lectures are online and people like me in sweatpants can sit sipping coffee and watch you give lectures? That
I think it's great. I do think that something's changed right now, which is, right now we're giving lectures over Zoom. I mean, giving seminars over Zoom and everything. I'm trying to figure out, I think it's a new medium.
Do you think it's
I'm trying to figure out how to exploit it.
Yeah, I've been quite cynical about human to human connection over that medium, but I think that's because it hasn't been explored fully. And teaching is a different thing.
Every lecture every seminar, even I think every talk I give, I is an opportunity to give that differently. I can deliver content directly into your browser. You have a WebGL engine right there. I can throw 3D content into your browser while you're listening to me, right?
Yeah. And
I can assume that you have at least a powerful enough laptop or something to watch Zoom while I'm doing that, while I'm giving a lecture. That's a new communication tool that I didn't have last year, right? And I think robotics can potentially benefit a lot from teaching that way. We'll see. It's going to be an experiment this fall.
It's interesting.
I'm thinking a lot about it.
Yeah, and also like the length of lectures or the length of like there's something. So like I guarantee you, it's like 80% of people who started listening to our conversation are still listening to now, which is crazy to me. But so there's a patience and interest in long form content, but at the same time, there's a magic to forcing yourself to condense an idea to as short as possible. Like clip. It can be part of a longer thing, but like just a really beautifully condensed an idea. There's a lot of opportunity there that's easier to do in remote with, I don't know, with editing too. Editing is an interesting thing. Like what, most professors don't get, when they give a lecture, don't get to go back and edit out parts, like crisp it up a little bit. That's also, it can do magic. Like if you remove like 5 to 10 minutes from an hour lecture, it can make something special of a lecture. I've seen that in myself. And in others too, because I edit other people's lectures to extract clips. It's like there's certain tangents they're not interesting. They're mumbling. They're not clarifying. They're not helpful at all. And once you remove them, it's just, I don't know. Editing can be magic.
Take a lot of time.
Yeah, it depends like what is teaching. You have to ask.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I find the editing process is also beneficial as for teaching, but also for your own learning. I don't know have you watched yourself on
sure. Yeah.
Have you watched those videos?
Not all of them.
It could be painful.
Yeah.
And to see like how to improve.
So do you find that I know you segment your podcast, do you think that helps people with the attention span aspect of it, or is it
segment like sections like
we're talking about this topic, whatever?
Nope, that just helps me. It's actually bad. So and you've been incredible. So I'm learning. Like I'm afraid of conversation. This is even today. I'm terrified of talking to you. I mean, it's something I'm trying to remove from myself. There's a guy. I mean, I've learned from a lot of people, but really. There's been a few people who's been inspirational to me in terms of conversation. Whatever people think of him, Joe Rogan has been inspirational to me because comedians have been too. Being able to just have fun and enjoy themselves and lose themselves in conversation, that requires you to be a great storyteller, to be able to pull a lot of different pieces of information together, but mostly just to enjoy yourself in conversations. And I'm trying to learn that. These notes you see me looking down, that's like a safety blanket that I'm trying to let go of more and more.
Cool.
So that people love just regular conversation. That's what the structure is like, whatever. I would say maybe like 10 to like, so there's a bunch of, there's probably a couple thousand PhD students listening to this right now. Right. And they might know what we're talking about. But there is somebody, I guarantee you right now, in Russia, some kid who's just smoked some weed, is sitting back and just enjoying the hell out of this conversation, not really understanding. He kind of watched some Boston Dynamics videos. He's just enjoying it. And I salute you, sir. No, but just like there's so much variety of people that just have curiosity about engineering, about sciences, about mathematics. And also like enjoying it is one thing, but I also often notice it inspires people to, there's a lot of people who are like in their undergraduate studies trying to figure out what to pursue. And these conversations can really spark the direction of their life. And in terms of robotics, I hope it does, because I'm excited about the possibilities of robotics. What books, 3 or so books, if any come to mind, technical, fiction, philosophical, would you recommend, had a big impact on you, or you just drew some insights from throughout your life?
Well, 2 of them we've already discussed. One is Plato's Dialogues which I started reading when I was like 13. Another is Ayn Rand, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. But I would say the Friedrich Hayek essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, which is about how decentralized mechanisms can work, also why they might go wrong. And that's where you start to understand the price system, capitalism. And that was in a book called Individualism and Economic Order, but it was just a few essays in that book. Those are maybe the three I would cite.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the...
Say the price of copper goes up, right? Because there's a problem with the copper mine in Chile or Bolivia. So the price of copper goes up all around the world. People are led to economize copper, to look for substitutes for copper, to change their production processes, to change the goods and services they buy, to build homes a different way. And this one event creates this one tiny change in information. This gets into your AI work very directly. And how much complexity that one change engenders in a meaningful, coherent way. How the different pieces of the price system fit together. Hayek really laid out very clearly. And it's like an AI problem. And how well, not for everything, but for many things, we solve that AI problem. I learned, I was, I think, 13, maybe 14 when I read Hayek.
Yeah, the distributed nature of things there.
And it's like your work on human attention. Like, how much can we take in?
Yes.
Very often not that much. And how many of the advances of modern civilization you need to understand as a response to that constraint. I got that also from Hayek.
And what's the title of the book again?
It's reprinted in a lot of books at this point. But back then, the book was called Individualism and Economic Order. But the essay's online. Hayek, Use of Knowledge in Society. There are open access versions of it through Google. And you don't need the whole book. Though it's a very good book.
People love it when I ask this kind of question about books, about ideas and philosophers and so on. I was wondering if you had books or ideas, philosophers, thinkers that had an influence on your life when you were growing up, or just today that you would recommend that people check out, blog posts, podcasts, videos, all that kind of stuff. Is there something that just kind of had an impact on you that you can recommend?
A super kind of obvious one that I was reading 0 to 1 while coming up with numeri. It's like I was like halfway through the book. And I really do like a lot of the ideas there, and it's also about kind of thinking big and also it's like peculiar little book. It's like why, like there's a little picture of the hipster versus Unabomber, and it's a weird little book. So I like, there's kind of like some depth there. So
in terms of a book on if you're thinking of doing a startup, that's a good book.
A book I like a lot is maybe my favorite book is David Deutsch's Beginning of Infinity. I just found that so optimistic. It puts you, everything you read in science, it like makes the world feel like kind of colder, because it's like, you know, we're just coming from evolution and coming from nothing should be this way or whatever, and humans are not very powerful, we're just like scum on the earth. And the way David Deutsch sees things and argues them with the same rigor that the cynics often use, and then has a much better conclusion. That's, some of the statements are things like, anything that doesn't violate the laws of physics can be solved.
So ultimately arriving at a hopeful path forward.
Without being like a hippie.
People love books. Is there some 3 or whatever number of books, technical, fiction, philosophical, that brought you joy in life, had an impact on your life, and maybe some that you would recommend others?
So I'll give you 3 very different books, and I also have a special runner-up.
Honorable mention.
It's an audiobook, and there's some specific reason behind it.
Okay.
So so the first book is something that sort of impacted my earlier stage of life, and I'm probably not going to be very original here. It's Bulgakov's Master and Margarita.
Nice.
So that's probably
Well, not for a Russian, maybe it's not super original, but it's it's a really powerful book for even in English. So I read it in English. So
it is incredibly powerful, and I mean, it's the way it ends, right? So I still have goosebumps when I read the very last sort of it's called prologue, where it's just so powerful.
What impact did it have on you? What ideas, what insights did you get from it?
I was just taken by, by the fact that you have those parallel lives apart from many centuries, right? And somehow they got sort of intertwined into one story. And that's, to me, was fascinating. And, of course, the romantic part of this book is like, it's not just, romance. It's like the romance empowered by sort of magic, right? So, and maybe on top of that, you have some irony, which unavoidable, right? So because it was that, the Soviet time.
But it's deeply Russian. So that's, the wit, the humor, the pain, the love, all of that is, one of the books that kind of captures something about Russian culture that people outside of Russia should probably read.
I agree.
What's the second one?
So the second one is again another one that it happened. I read it later in my life. I think I read it first time when I was a graduate student, and that's the Solzhenitsyn's Cancer Ward. That is amazingly powerful book.
What is it about?
It's about, essentially based on Solzhenitsyn was diagnosed with cancer when he was reasonably young, and he made a full recovery. But so this is about a person who was sentenced for life in one of these camps, and he had some cancer. So he was, transported back to one of these Soviet republics. I think it was, South Asian republics. And the book is about, his experience being a prisoner, being a patient in the cancer clinic, in a cancer ward, surrounded by people, many of which die, right? But in a way, the way it reads. First of all, later on, I read the accounts of the doctors who described this, the experiences, in the book by the patient as incredibly accurate. Right. So, I read that there was, some doctors saying that, every single doctor should read this book to understand what the patient feels. But, again, as many of the Solzhenitsyn's books, it has multiple levels of complexity. And obviously the if you look above the cancer and the patient, the tumor that was growing and then disappeared in his in his body with some consequences. This is allegorically the Soviet. And he actually he agreed. When he was asked, he said that this is what made him think about this, how to combine these experiences. Him being a part of the, of the Soviet regime, also being a part of of someone sent to Gulag camp, right? Yeah. And also someone who experienced cancer in his life. The Gulag Archipelago and this book, these are the works that actually made him, receive a Nobel Prize. But to me, I've read different other books by Solzhenitsyn. This one is, to me, is the most powerful one that.
And by the way, both this one and the previous one you read in Russian?
Yes. So now there is the third book is an English book, and it's completely different. So we're switching the gears completely. So this is the book which it's not even a book. It's a It's an essay by John von Neumann.
Oh, wow.
Called The Computer and the Brain. And that was the book he was writing knowing that he was dying of cancer.
Wow.
So the book was released back. It's a very thin book, right? But the power, the intellectual power in this book, in this essay, is incredible. I mean, you probably know that von Neumann is considered to be one of these biggest thinkers, right? So his intellectual power was incredible, right? And you can actually feel this power in this book where, the person is writing knowing that he will be, he will die. The book actually got published only after his death back in 1958. He died in 1957. But he tried to put as many ideas that, he still hadn't realized. And, so this book is very difficult to read because, every single paragraph is just compact, is filled with these ideas. And, the ideas are incredible. Even nowadays, so he tried to put the parallels between the brain computing power, the neural system, and the computers, as they were
Do you
understood.
remember what year he was working on this? Like approximately
57.
57.
So that was right during his, when he was diagnosed with cancer, and he was essentially.
Yeah, he's one of those. There's a few folks people mention. I think Ed Witten is another that like everyone that meets them, they say he's just an intellectual powerhouse.
Yes.
Okay, so who's the honorable mention?
And this is, I mean, the reason I put it sort of in a separate section, because this is a book that I recently listened to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an audio book, and this is a book called Lab Girl by Hope Jahren. So Hope Jahren she is a scientist. She's a geochemist that essentially studies the fossil plants, and so uses this fossil plant, the chemical analysis to understand what was the climate back in in thousand years, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so something that incredibly touched me by this book, it was narrated by the author.
Nice.
And it's
excellent.
In an incredibly personal story. Incredibly. So certain parts of the book, you could actually hear the author crying. And that, to me, I mean, I never experienced anything like this, reading the book. But it was like, the connection between you and the author. And I think this is really a must read, but even better, a must listen to audiobook for anyone who wants to learn about sort of, academia, science, research in general, because it's a very personal account about her becoming a scientist.
People love it when I ask about books. I don't know if whether technical, like legal or fiction, nonfiction books throughout your life have had an impact on you. If there's something you could recommend or something you could speak to about something that inspired ideas, insights about this world, complicated world of ours.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I'll give you a couple. So one is Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity by Richard Rorty. He's passed away now, but was a philosopher at some of our major institutions, Princeton, Harvard, Stanford. Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, at least that's a book that really helped me work through a series of thoughts. So it stands for the proposition that our most deeply held beliefs are contingent, that there's nothing beyond history or prior to socialization that's definitory of the human being. That's Rorty. And he says that our most deeply held beliefs are received wisdom and highly contingent along a number of registers. And he does that, but then goes on to say that he nonetheless can hold strongly held beliefs, recognizing their contingency, but still believes them to be true and accurate. And it helps you to work through what could be an intellectual tension. Other words, so you don't delve into, one doesn't delve into relativism. Everything is okay, but he gives you a vocabulary to think about how to negotiate these realities.
Do you share this tension? I mean, there is a real tension. It seems like even like the law, the legal system is all just a construct of our human ideas, and yet it seems to be almost feels fundamental to what a just society is.
Yeah, I definitely share the tension and love his vocabulary and the way he's helped me resolve the tension. So, right, I mean, yeah. So, like, infanticide, for example, perhaps it's socially contingent, perhaps it's received wisdom, perhaps it's anthropological. We need to propagate the species, and I still think it's wrong. Yeah. And Rorty has helped me develop a category to say that no, I can't provide any, in Rorty's words, non-circular theoretical backup for this proposition. At some point, it's going to run me into a circularity problem, but that's okay. I hold this nonetheless in full recognition of its contingency. But what it does is makes you humble, and when you're humble, that's good, because this notion that ideas are always already in progress, never fully formed, I think is the sort of intellectual I strive to be. And if I have a sufficient degree of humility that I don't have the final answer, capital A, then that's going to help me to get to better answers, lowercase a. And Rorty does that. And he talks about in the solidarity part of the book, he has this concept of the imaginative ability to see other different people as we instead of they. And I just think it's a beautiful concept. But he talks about this imaginative ability, and it's this active process. So, I mean, so that's a book that's done a lot of work for me over the years. Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois was absolutely pivotal in my intellectual development. One of the premier set of essays in the Western literary tradition, and it's a deep and profound sociological, philosophical, and historical analysis of the predicament of Blacks in America from one of our country's greatest polymaths. It's a beautiful text, and I go to it yearly.
So for somebody like me, so growing up in the Soviet Union, the struggle, the civil rights movement, the struggle of race, and all those kinds of things, that is, it's universal, but it's also very much a journey of the United States. It was kind of a foreign thing that I stepped into. Is that something you would recommend somebody like me to read, or is there other things about race that are good to connect to? Because my flavor of suffering and justice, I'm a Jew as well. My flavor has to do with World War II and the studies of that, all the injustices there. Yeah. So I'm now stepping into a new set of injustices and trying to learn the landscape.
I would say anyone is a better person for having read Du Bois. It's just he's just a remarkable writer and thinker, and and to the extent you're interested in learning another history, he does it in a way that is quite sophisticated. So it's it's interesting. I was going to give you 3 books. I noted the accent when I met you, but I didn't know exactly where you're from.
Yes.
But the other book I was going to say is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment.
Oh, great.
And I mean, I've always wanted to go to St. Pete's just to sort of see with my own eyes what the word pictures that Dostoevsky created in Crime and Punishment. And, I love others of his stuff too, the brothers Karamazov and so forth. But Crime and Punishment, I first read in high school as a junior or a senior. And it is a deep and profound meditation on both the meaning and the measure of our lives. And Dostoevsky, obviously in conversation with other thinkers, really gets at the crux of a fundamental philosophical problem. What does it mean to be a human being? And for that, Crime and Punishment captured me as a teenager, and that's another text that I return to often.
Is there books or movies in your life long ago or recently that had a big impact on you?
Yes.
Something you were.
Yes. My favorite novel, I always tell people this, I love reading novels. I'm a historian, and I think the historian and the novelist are actually, and the technology innovator are all actually one and the same. We're all
storytellers,
and we're all in the imagination space. And, I'm trying to imagine the world of the past to inform us in the present for the future. So one of my favorite novels that I read, actually when I was in graduate school, is Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks. And it's the story of a family in Lübeck in northern Germany living through the 19th century and the rise and fall of families, cycles of life, many things we've talked about in the last couple of hours, cycles of life, challenges of adjusting to the world around you. And it's just a very moving reflection on the limits of human agency and how we all have to understand the circumstances we're in and adjust to them. And there's triumph and tragedy in that. It's a wonderful novel. It used to be a kind of canonical work. It's sort of fallen out now. It's a big, big novel, but I'm very moved by that. I'm very moved by Tolstoy's War and Peace. I assign that every year to my students. That's a big, big book. But what Tolstoy challenges is he challenges the notion that a Napoleon can rule the world. And we're all little Napoleons, right? We're all sort of thinking that we're going to do that. And he reminds us how much is contingency, circumstance. It doesn't mean we don't have some.
People love book recommendations. Let me ask, what 3 books?
Oh, you can't just give me 3. I mean, really? 3?
What 7.5 books you can recommend? So you're also the author of 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. You're author of How Emotions Are Made. Okay. So definitely those are the top 2 recommendations of all, the 2 greatest books of all time. Other than that, are there books that, technical, fiction, philosophical, that you've enjoyed or you might recommend to others?
Yes. Actually, every PhD student, when they graduate with their PhD, I give them like a little library, like a set of books, some of which they've already read, some of which I want them to read, I think nonfiction books I would read. The things I would recommend are The Triple Helix by Richard Lewontin. It's a little book published in 2000, which is, I think, a really good introduction to complexity and population thinking as opposed to essentialism. So essentialism is this idea that, there's an essence to each person, whether it's a soul or your genes or what have you, as opposed to this idea that we have the kind of nature that requires a nurture. You are the product of a complex dance between an environment, between a set of genes and an environment that turns those genes on and off to produce your brain and your body and really who you are at any given moment.
It's a good title for that. Triple helix. So playing on the double helix where it's just the biology, it's bigger than the biology.
Exactly. It's a wonderful book. I've read it probably 6 or 7 times throughout the year. He has another book too, which is, it's more, I think scientists would find it I don't know. I loved it. It's called Biology as Ideology. And it really is all about, I wouldn't call it one of the best books of all time, but I love the book because it really does point out, that science as it's currently practiced. I mean, the book was written in 1991, but it actually, I think, still holds. That science as it's currently practiced has a set of ontological commitments which are somewhat problematic.
So the assumptions are limiting.
Yeah,
So like
in ways that it's like you're a fish in water and you don't like. Okay,
right.
so so here's
David Foster Wallace stuff.
But here's a really cool thing I just learned recently. Is it okay to go off on this tangent for a minute?
Yeah. Let's go tangents. Great.
Okay. I was just going to say that I just learned recently that we don't have water receptors on our skin. So how do you know when you're sweating? How do you know when a raindrop, when it's going to rain and, like a raindrop hits your skin and you can feel that little drop of wetness? Yeah. How is it that you feel that drop of wetness when we don't have water receptors in our skin? And my
mind is blown already.
Yeah, that was my reaction too, right? I was like, of course we don't, because we evolved in the water.
Yeah.
Like, why would we need, it was just this, like, you have these moments where you're like, oh, of course, there's so.
You'll never see rain the same way again.
So the answer is it's a combination of temperature and touch.
Yeah.
But it's a complex sense that's only computed in your brain. There's no receptor for it. Anyways.
Yeah, that's why like snow versus cold rain versus warm rain all feel different because you're trying to infer stuff from the temperature and the size of the droplets. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, your brain is a prediction machine. It's using lots and lots of information and combining it. Anyway, so Biology as Ideology is, I wouldn't say it's one of the greatest books of all time, but it is a really useful book. There's a book by, if you're interested in psychology or the mind at all, there's a wonderful book, it's a fairly small book called Naming the Mind by Kurt Danziger, who's a historian of psychology. Everybody in my lab reads both of these books.
So what's the book?
It's about the origin of where did we get the theory of mind that we have, that the human mind is populated by thoughts and feelings and perceptions, and where did those categories come from? Because they don't exist in all cultures.
Oh, so that's a cultural construct?
The idea that you have thoughts and feelings and they're very distinct is definitely a cultural construct.
It's another mind-blowing thing, just like the rain.
Kurt Danziger is the opening chapter in that book is absolutely mind-blowing. I love it. I just think it's fantastic. And I would say that there are many, many popular science books that I could recommend that I think are extremely well written in their own way. Before maybe I said this to you, but before I undertook writing How Emotions Are Made, I read, I don't know, somewhere on the order of 50 or 60 popular science books to try to figure out how to write a popular science book. Because while there are many books about writing, Stephen King has a great book about on writing, and where he gives tips interlaced with his own personal history. That was where I learned you write for a specific person. You have a specific person in mind, and that's, for me, that person is Dan.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation to have, like which popular science books, like what you learned from that search.
Yeah.
Because there's I have some popular science books, so like I just roll my eyes, like this is too. It's like same with TED Talks. Like some of them go too much into the flowery, and I would say don't give enough respect to the intelligence of the reader. But this is my own bias, very specific.
I completely agree with you, and in fact, I have a colleague. His name is Van Yang, who, he produced a cinematic lecture of How Emotions Are Made that we wrote together with Joseph Fridman, No relation.
Yes. Well, we're all related.
Well, I mean, you and I are probably, have some,
Yeah.
But
I remember. It's the memories are in there somewhere.
So, it's from many, many, many generations ago. Well, half my family is Russian, so from
the good half.
The good half, right? But his goal actually is to produce, videos and lectures that are beautiful and educational and that don't dumb the material down. And he's really remarkable at it, actually. I mean, but again, that's good. That requires a bit of a paradigm shift. We could have a whole conversation about the split between entertainment and education in this country and why it is the way it is. But that's another conversation.
To be continued.
But I would say if I were to pick one book that I think is a really good example of good science writing, it would be The Beak of the Finch, which won a Pulitzer Prize a number of years ago, and I'm not remembering the author's name. I'm blanking.
But I'm guessing is it focusing on birds and the evolution of birds? Actually,
there's also The Evolution of Beauty, which is also a great book. But The Beak of the Finch is it has two storylines that are interwoven. One is about Darwin and Darwin's explorations in the Galapagos Island, and then modern day researchers from Princeton who have a research program in the Galapagos looking at Darwin's finches. Mm-hmm. And it's just first of all, there's top-notch science in there, and really science, evolutionary biology that a lot of people don't know. And it's told really, really well.
It sounds like there's a narrative in there. It's like storytelling too.
Yeah, I think all good popular science books are storytelling, but storytelling grounded, constrained by, the evidence. And then I just want to say that for fiction, I'm a really big fan of love stories, just to return us to the topic that we began with. And so some of my favorite love stories are Major Pettigrew's Last Stand by Helen Simonson. It's a love story about people who you wouldn't expect to fall in love and all the people around them who have to overcome their prejudices. And I love this book.
What do you like? Like, what makes a good love story?
There isn't one thing. There are many different things that make a good love story. But I think in this case, you can feel you can feel the journey. You can feel the journey that these characters are on, and all the people around them are on this journey too, basically to come to grips with this really unexpected love, really profound love that develops between these two characters who are very unlikely to have fallen in love, but they do. And it's very gentle. Another book like that is the Storied Life of A.J. Fierke, which is also a love story, but in this case, it's a love story between a little girl and her adopted dad. And the dad is this real curmudgeon-y, guy. But of course, there's a story there. And it's just a beautiful love story. But it's like everybody in this community falls in love with him because he falls in love with her. And she just gets left at his store, his bookstore. He has this failing bookstore. And he discovers that, he feels inexplicably this need to take care of this little baby. And this whole life emerges out of that one decision, which is really beautiful, actually. Very poignant.
Do you think the greatest stories have a happy ending? Or a heartbreak at the end?
That's such a Russian question. It's like Russian tragedies, you know.
So I would say the answer to that for me, there has to be heartbreak.
Yeah, I really don't like heartbreak. I don't like heartbreak. I want there to be a happy ending, or at least a hopeful ending. But you know, like Dr. Zhivago, like, or The English Patient. Oh my goodness! Like, why? Oh, it's just, yeah, no. Mm-mm.
Well, I don't think there's a better way to end it on a happy note like this. Lisa, like I said, I'm a huge fan of yours. Thank you for wasting yet more time with me talking again. People should definitely get your book. And maybe one day I can't wait to talk to your husband as well.
Well, right back at you, Lexi.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Lisa Feldman Barrett. And thank you to our sponsors, Athletic Greens, the all-in-one drink that I start every day with to cover all my nutritional bases, 8 Sleep, a mattress that cools itself and gives me yet another reason to enjoy sleep, Masterclass, online courses that I enjoy from some of the most amazing humans in history, and BetterHelp, online therapy with a licensed professional. Please check out these sponsors in the description to get a discount and to support this podcast. If you enjoy this thing, subscribe on YouTube, review it with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow on Spotify, support on Patreon, or connect with me on Twitter at Lex Fridman. And now, let me leave you with some words from Sun Tzu and the Art of War. There are not more than 5 musical notes, yet the combination of these 5 give rise to more melodies that can ever be heard. There are not more than 5 primary colors, yet in combination they produce more hues than can ever be seen. There are not more than 5 cardinal tastes, and yet combinations of them yield more flavors than can ever be tasted. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time.
Fascinating.
You know, people love it when I ask about books. I don't know if books, whether fiction, nonfiction, technical, or completely non-technical, had an impact in your life throughout. If there's anything you would recommend, or even just mention as something that gave you an insight or moved you in some way.
So, okay. So I don't know if I recommend, because in some sense you almost had to be Italian or to be such a scholar. But being Italian, one thing that really impressed me tremendously is the Divine Comedy. It is a medieval poem, a very long poem, divided in 3 parts: Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. Okay, and that is the non-trivial story of a middleman man gets into a crisis, personal crisis, and then out of this crisis he makes a catharsis, purifies himself more and more and more until he's become capable of actually meeting God. Okay? And that is actually a complex story. So you have to get some very sophisticated language, maybe Latin at that point, right? We were talking about 1200s Italy, right? In Florence. And this guy instead, he chose his own dialect, not spoken outside his own immediate circle, right? A Florentine dialect. And actually, Dante really made Italian. He was, and so I said, how can you express such a sophisticated things and so this? And then the point is that these words that nobody actually knew because they were essentially dialect, and plus a bunch of very intricate rhymes in which they had to rhyme the things, and turns out that by getting meaning from the things that you rhyme, you essentially guess what the word means, and you invent Italian, and you communicate by almost osmosis what you want. Yeah. It's a miracle of communication. In a dialect, a very poor language, very unsophisticated, to express a very sophisticated situation. I love it. People who love it, and Italians and not Italian. But what I got of it is that, very often limitations are our strength. Because if you limit yourself at a very poor language, somehow you get out of it and you achieve even better form of communication. If you're using a hyper-sophisticated literary language with lots of resonance from prior books so that you can actually instantaneously quote. He couldn't quote anything because nothing was written in Italian before him. So I really felt that limitations are our strength. And I think that rather than complaining about the limitations, we should embrace them, because if we embrace our limitation, limited as we are, we find very creative solutions that people with less limitation we have, we would not even think about it.
Wow. So limitation is a kind of superpower if you choose to see it that way. Is there, since you speak both languages, is there something that's lost in translation to you? Is there something you can express in Italian that you can't in English, and vice versa maybe? Is there something you could say to the musicality of the language? I mean, I've been to Italy a few times, and I'm not sure if it's the actual words, but it's the people are certainly very, there's body language too. There's just their whole being is language. So I don't know if you miss some of that when you're speaking English in this country.
Yes. In fact, actually, I miss it, and somehow it was a sacrifice that I made consciously. By the time I arrived, I knew that I was not going to express myself at that level, and it was actually a sacrifice because given you have also your mother tongue is Russian, so you know that you can be very expressive in your mother tongue and not very expressive with a new tongue, a new language. And then what people think of you in the new language, because when the precise of expression of things, it generates, it shows, elegance, or it shows, knowledge, or it shows as a census, or it shows as a caste, or education, whatever it is. So all of a sudden I found myself on the bottom. So I had to fight all my way back up. And but I'm saying I go back
it's
to
fascinating, right?
Their limitations are actually our strength. In fact, it's a trick to limit yourself to exceed, right? And there are examples in history. If you think about Hernan Cortez, right? He goes to invade Mexico. He has a few hundred people with him, and he has 100,000 people in arms on the other side. First thing he does, he limits himself. He sinks his own ship. There is no return. Okay. And at that point, he actually managed
that's really
to come
profound.
up victorious.
I actually, first of all, that's inspiring to me. I feel like I have quite a few limitations, but more practically on the Russian side, I'm going to try to do a couple of really big and really tough interviews in Russian. Once COVID lifts a little bit, I'm traveling to Russia, and I'll keep your advice in mind that the limitations is a kind of superpower. We should use it to our advantage, because you do feel less like you're not able to convey your wisdom in the Russian language. Because I moved here when I was 13, so you don't, the parts of life you live under a certain language are the parts of life you're able to communicate. I became a thoughtful, deeply thoughtful human in English. But the pain from World War II, the music of the people, that was instilled with me in Russian. So I can carry both of those, and there's limitations in both. I can't say philosophically profound stuff in Russian, but I can't in English express like that melancholy feeling of like the people. And so combining those two, I'll somehow.
Beautifully said. Thanks for sharing. This is great. Yes, I totally understand.
People often kind of wonder, world-class researchers such as yourself, what kind of books, technical, fiction, philosophical, had an impact on you in your life, and maybe ones you could possibly recommend that others read. Maybe if you have 3 books that pop into mind.
Yeah. So I definitely liked Judea Pearl's book, Probabilistic Reasoning and Intelligent Systems. It's a very deep technical book. But what I liked is that, so there are many places where you can learn about probabilistic graphical models from. But throughout this book, Judiapol kind of sprinkles his philosophical observations and he thinks about connects to how the brain thinks and attentions and resources, all those things. So that whole thing makes it more interesting to read.
He emphasizes the importance of causality.
So that was in his later book. So this was the first book, Probabilistic Reasoning in Intelligence Systems. He mentions causality, but he hadn't really sunk his teeth into, like, how do you actually formalize
Got it.
Yeah. And the second book, Causality, was 2000, the one in 2000. That one is really hard, so I wouldn't recommend that.
Yeah, so that looks at the mathematical, his model of
do calculus.
Do calculus, yeah, it was pretty dense mathematically.
Right. The Book of Why is definitely more enjoyable.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So I would recommend Probabilistic Reasoning in Intelligence Systems. Another book I liked was one from Doug Hofstadter. This was a long time ago. He had a book, I think it was called The Mind's Eye. It was probably Hofstadter and Daniel Dennett together. So,
and I actually was I bought that book. It's on my shelf. I haven't read it yet, but I couldn't get an electronic version of it, which is annoying because I read everything on Kindle.
Oh, okay.
So you had to actually purchase the physical. It's like one of the only physical books I have. Anyway, there's a lot of people recommended it highly. So yeah.
And the third one I would definitely recommend reading is this is not a technical book. It is history. It's the name of the book, I think, is Bishop's Boys. It's about Wright brothers and their path and how it was. There are multiple books on this topic, and all of them are great. It's fascinating how flight was treated as an unsolvable problem, and also what aspects did people emphasize. People thought, it is all about just powerful engines. Just need to have powerful lightweight engines. Some people thought of it as how far can we just throw the thing? Just throw it
like a catapult.
Yeah. So it's a very fascinating, and even after they made the invention, people not believing it, and
the social aspect of it.
The social aspect. It's different. Very fascinating.
I mean, do you draw any parallels between birds fly? So there's the natural approach to flight, and then there's the engineered approach. Do you see the same kind of thing with the brain and our trying to engineer intelligence?
Yeah, it's a good analogy to have. Of course, all analogies have their
limits.
So
For sure.
merits. So people in AI often use airplanes as an example of, hey, we didn't learn anything from birds. Look,
right.
But the funny thing is that, and the saying is, airplanes don't flap wings.
Yeah.
Right. This is what they say. The funny thing and the ironic thing is that you don't need to flap to fly is something Wright brothers found by observing birds. So they have in their notebook, in some of these books, they show their notebook drawings, right? They make detailed notes about buzzards just soaring over thermals. And they basically say, look, flapping is not the important, propulsion is not the important problem to solve here. We want to solve control. And once you solve control, propulsion will fall into place. All of these are people, they realize this by observing birds.
Beautifully put. That's actually brilliant, because people do use that analogy a lot. I'm going to have to remember that one. Do you have advice for people interested in artificial intelligence, like young folks today? I talk to undergraduate students all the time. Interested in neuroscience, interested in understanding how the brain works. Is there advice you would give them about their career, maybe about their life in general?
Sure. I think every piece of advice should be taken with a pinch of salt, of course, because each person is different. Their motivations are different. But I can definitely say, if your goal is to understand the brain from the angle of wanting to build one, then being an experimental neuroscientist might not be the way to go about it. a better way to pursue it might be through computer science, electrical engineering, machine learning, and AI. And of course, you have to study up the neuroscience, but that you can do on your own. If you are more attracted by finding something intriguing discovering something intriguing about the brain, then of course it is better to be an experimentalist. So find that motivation. What are you intrigued by? And of course, find your strengths too. Some people are very good experimentalists, and they enjoy doing that.
And it's interesting to see which department, if you're picking in terms of like your education path, whether to go with like at MIT, it's brain and computer, BCS.
Yeah.
Brain and cognitive sciences, or the CS side of things.
Right.
And actually, the brain folks, the neuroscience folks, are more and more now embracing of, learning TensorFlow and PyTorch. Right. They see the power of trying to engineer ideas that they get from the brain and then explore how those could be used to create intelligent systems. So that might be the right department, actually.
Yeah.
So
this was a question in one of the Redwood Neuroscience Institute workshops that Jeff Hawkins organized almost 10 years ago. This question was put to a panel, right? What should be the undergrad major you should take if you want to understand the brain? And the majority opinion in that one was electrical engineering.
Interesting.
Because I'm a doubly undergrad, so I got lucky in that way. But I think it does have some of the right ingredients, because you learn about circuits, you learn about how you can construct circuits to approach, do functions. You learn about microprocessors. You learn information theory. You learn signal processing. You learn continuous math. So in that way, it's a good step to, if you want to go to computer science or neuroscience, it's a good step.
The downside, you're more likely to be forced to use MATLAB. so one of the interesting things about, this is changing. The world is changing, but like certain departments lagged on the programming side of things,
right.
On developing good habits in terms of software engineering. But I think that's more and more changing, and students can take that into their own hands, like learn to program. I feel like everybody should learn to program, because it like everyone in the sciences, because it puts the data at your fingertips. So you can organize it, you can find all kinds of things in the data, and then you can also, for the appropriate sciences, build systems that like based on that. So like then engineer. What books? People love this question. And you're exceptionally well read. You've explored all kinds of ideas. Is there some books, technical, fiction, philosophical, coloring books, children's books, had an impact on your life and you would maybe recommend to others that they should read?
I think we mentioned a couple of them here today, but I think a really useful triplet of books that I've been recommending recently to help diffuse this materialist worldview of reality, where we still think in kind of the Newtonian model that it's atoms and cause and effect. And I'd first recommend Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning. It's a deep dive into mythology and how it's developed over the course of history, and how it's reflected both in our social structures and our intrapsychic nature, really, and how they come to reflect one another in a way. Like the way we think, again, shapes the world, and then the way the world is shapes the way we think. That's an excellent book. It's a very dense and difficult read. Actually, this trilogy is pretty brutal. Probably take you a year to read, hours a day. The second one I mentioned earlier was Human Action by Mises. The ultimate tome on Austrian economics will help explicate this realm of relevance, I think, that economics truly is, where, again, there are things, and then these things become means or ends once we channel our purpose through them. So this realm of non-materialist relevance that I think is really important to grasping economics at a first principles level. I think that book lays it out tremendously. And then the last one would be, I think I mentioned this at the beginning, was that book Leela by Robert Pirsig, where he's, making the case that value is fundamental. And all of these books, they kind of all point to that, actually. They're pointing back to value being the fundamental thing, values expressed through moral action as being the fundamental substrate of reality. So it'll, if you're like me, that I grew up quite scientific minded, it'll help diffuse some of that and maybe retrain you to the other side of reality.
So you said these books are difficult. Maybe you can comment on which aspect is difficult. Is it just the technical nature? Is it the length? Is it the depth of the ideas, or how long it takes to integrate them? And more sort of importantly, is there recommendation, advice you can give on how to integrate these ideas, how to read, how to learn in this space? Is there, from your own life, like how do you enjoy taking in ideas? And this could be for these books, but also in the Bitcoin world and reading a bunch of different ideas written by others, just integrating stuff, even watching podcasts and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'm a reader. I love to read. One of the most useful things I've ever done was take a speed reading course. I actually think there's a version of this available on Tim Ferriss's website. It's like a 30-minute speed reading course. It's all about eye movement. Instead of moving your eye continuously line over line, it's more about jumping, and your brain, you can train your brain to just absorb words in their totality versus kind of reading word by word.
And also not, I haven't fully taken that journey actually, but I remember taking a few steps on that journey, realizing that I'm speaking inside my head.
Yeah.
I'm saying the words inside my head, and that's actually getting in the way.
That's right.
So there's a lot of little hacks like that. I maybe lazily, I'll have to, now that you mention, I'll have to revisit this.
Yeah.
But I have convinced myself that I don't need to read faster, because that's not ultimately the bottleneck. The bottleneck is in me thinking about stuff. In fact, I like reading really slowly, or so I convinced myself. Because ultimately it's not about gaining more information. It's about time spent thinking deeply.
Yes.
But maybe that's just me being very lazy, because yes, it's true, it's important to think deeply, but maybe I could speed up the consumption of information.
Well, it's fun. I like to be dynamic, actually. So usually speed reading initially, and that diffused that internal dialogue for me, because when I was reading one word at a time, I was having that too. You almost get a feedback in your own head when you're reading the word out loud and it's clouding your thoughts.
Yeah.
If you're speed reading, you can't do that. Yeah. You're taking in groups of words at a time, so you can't internally verbalize it, I guess. And then I also am really big on annotating, underlining, writing in the margins. I prefer a physical book, but I also read the Kindle a lot because it's just so convenient. Anywhere you're waiting in line, or every night before bed, I'm reading my Kindle. And I also advocate rereading a lot. So if you found something that, struck you at a deep level, or you found particularly fascinating, like, you have to listen to that. That's your mind or your spirit's signal that is something meaningful to you. And you should, to your point, reread it, sit with it for a long time, write about it. And that becomes the ultimate triumvirate of synthesizing an idea, actually. If you can read about it and then write about it and then go and talk about it, you get this crystallization of understanding that's just not possible doing any one of the three or any two of the three. So definitely highly recommend people to do that. And in terms of how are those books difficult? I mean, in every way. They're all long books. In terms of density, I would say Leela is the least dense. Maybe Maps of Meaning. I don't know, but Maps of Meaning and Human Action are both extremely dense. But they're just, I had to read those books very slow. You just have to take your time with them. To give you an idea, with Jordan Peterson, he's said this a lot with Maps of Meaning. He spent 3 hours a day writing for 15 years to write that book. It's probably, I think it's a 600-page book. He said he estimates he rewrote every sentence in the book 50 times, 50, to try and get it, just perfected. And when you read these sentences, you can tell that he rewrote it 50 times.
I've used actually Anki for spaced repetition. It's like it's an app. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it allows you to load in facts or terms or entire paragraphs, and then it brings them, you review them every day, and then it brings them up less and less often over time as you show yourself being able to remember the thing that you wanted to memorize. And oftentimes when I'm reading, what I want to memorize is the key idea. But also, like, I use it for, I'm terrible with names, so I'm started to use it for names too, of names of people, names of like people that I want to remember.
Yeah.
And also throughout history and also in my own personal life, but also events. You know, dates to me are usually not important, but sometimes dates are really important. And so it's really useful. I recommend it highly. Naval, I think, mentioned a piece of software called Readwise or something like that. That I hope I'm saying that correctly. It's something like that. And what it does is it goes to your highlights from your Kindle or the various places where you highlight stuff that integrates with Goodreads. And it does the same kind of spaced repetition, but for things you've highlighted.
That's super cool.
It sends an email every day. It's been really, I recommend it highly because it sends, like, to me in email form a selection of the things I've highlighted and previous things I've read. And it's like this weird, like, shock to your memory of that sprinkles, like, I have probably way too much Orwell in there. And it just kind of like, it brings you back. And these ideas are, because what you realize, depending on how you highlight, but at least for me, and I think it's probably true for a lot of people, the things you've highlighted had at that moment like an emotional impact on you.
Yeah. And
so, like, these things are just like hitting you hard again.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa. It might not be meaningful to anyone else except you, and it's something I recommend. You never know with these like hacks or tools and so on, like what's actually BS and what is amazing, and that one is kind of amazing. So, at least for me, it works for me and Naval. I think he's the one.
Readwise, you said.
Readwise,
yeah,
or something close to that.
Yeah,
it could be read something else, like Read Wealth or something.
The one other thing I really like, and this is more of a new one, is I used to always listen to music at the gym, but now I've just, because I'm so backlogged on podcasts, right? There's so many. I exclusively listen to podcasts when I'm walking or when I'm at the gym, anytime I'm doing something that I can't, read, basically. And I think there's something really special about exercise and ideation. I mean, I don't know if this happens to everyone, but my creative juices just go ballistic when I'm at the gym. Like, I hit a certain point of, I guess, heart rate, and you're sweating enough, then the ideas just start to flow.
Yeah.
So I'm basically at the gym now, listening to podcasts, exercising as fast as I can to try to get to that state of, where you're just strenuous exercise, I guess you would say. And then end up typing notes into my phone as fast as I can with all these ideas that are flowing. So I've created a lot of good writing out of that.
Yeah, it's kind of work. So I do running quite a bit. So running outside, and I'll listen to. I told myself, this has been going on for about a year. Is I only listen like the stuff that's either World War II or World War I related. So Hitler, Stalin, like difficult historical stuff. And also listen to brown noise. So those are the two modes. So brown noise helps me. It's like white noise, but like deeper, I guess. It helps me remove the world. At the gym, there's a lot of distractions. When you're running, there's a lot of distractions. It helps me remove the world. So one, I'll be listening to difficult historical ideas. And then when my mind is all of a sudden starting to generate ideas, I'll listen to brown noise, and I'll then force myself to think. It's it's meditative in a sense, and your mind wants to be lazy. It's hard, man, for like running and thinking, in the sense that some of the ideas that come into your head are pretty heavy. It's about your own life. It's your own demons come in there, but also just difficult ideas that require you thinking through. And persevering through that, like not letting yourself get lazy and like thinking through it has been really for me rewarding in the same way that you're saying it is for you. It's true that like podcasts and music, like shallow, like funny podcasts or music have been a kind of filler distraction. But informational podcasts, like podcasts that have some depths of ideas or audiobooks, have been truly rewarding. I try to listen now less and less to podcasts that are just fun, because I feel like I enjoy it too much, and I don't allow my mind to get bored and to think through stuff, to explore ideas. Yeah. It's so easy to fill the space that usually would be filled with thought, and instead fill it with fun podcasts. Like there's a bunch of comedy podcasts I really enjoy. So there's value to that, of course, but you have to realize it's entertainment. It's not, it's not, you don't get much value except entertainment.
Right. And there's utility to the boredom too, I think, where to give your mind the space, I guess your subconscious, maybe the space to chew on some of these problems, right? Where you've imbibed so much knowledge, you've highlighted and thought about something, but then you need to stop thinking about it for a while and let it marinate in the subconscious. And then, these flashes of insight that people have described, sometimes I get them in the middle of the night, like I just wake up from a dream and have them and I got to write it down, or sometimes it's in nature, taking a walk. But I think that's very important too. We can't just brute force our way into understanding. There's this interplay between kind of the brute force reading intake and then just relaxing, meditating, sleeping, being bored, letting your subconscious do the heavy lifting. And
there's you should be aware of the fact that there's a war for your attention going on. So there's a lot of there's been better and better and better mechanisms that are designed to steal your attention. So I kind of see it as a war zone between my right for boredom and the internet wanting your attention. In fact, Clubhouse as an app has been, I'm probably not going to use Clubhouse much anymore, because there's some aspect of my own inner loneliness and whatever it is that pulled me into Clubhouse a little bit too much, to where it robbed me from that lonely time alone where I sit and listen to Bruce Springsteen and think about life. Right? So I want to.
That's way more important.
That's way well, yeah. At least it's all in balance, because there is a Clubhouse, like a lot of these social networks, when used right, can be a way to discover new ideas, new people. But the boredom and just being alone with your thoughts is priceless.
Absolutely. And you got to know yourself, right? Like, it took me a long time to realize I need solitude.
Yeah.
Like, just how I'm wired, how I'm built. I need like an hour a day solitude. So you got to listen to that part of yourself. You might be compromising something like that, where you feel like you always need to be with your girlfriend or whatever it may be, but I would suggest listening to that voice.
Yeah, I try to remember things that made me feel good over time, like long-term had positive impact and long-term had negative impact, and do more of the former and less of the latter.
Yeah.
We don't often think like that. We talked offline about like carnivore diets, for example. I try to remember that carbs don't make me feel good.
Yeah.
In the moment, it's hard to remember that.
It's hard.
But you have to remember that's the case. And in the same way, exercise, it's hard to remember that exercise makes me feel good.
Especially when it's time to go to the gym.
Especially when it's time to go to the gym. But you should remember that, because the kind of person you are without exercise, for me, just like he's beautifully said, that you have to know yourself. The kind of person I am without exercise is a less good person, a person I'm less proud of.
Yeah. The food thing is so hard, by the way. I still, I can't tell you how many times I've learned the lesson, like, don't eat that. But then, you go a few weeks of not eating whatever that is, and you're feeling good. Yeah. And then you're, I don't know, something creeps up inside you, like, you could just have one, or you could just do this. But for me, it's sugar. Like, sugar just makes me feel terrible. But not always, but if it's been a long time, I start to make that exception in my mind, like, you can have a little bit.
Yeah.
And then I eat it and I feel terrible. So I don't know how many times I've done that dance, but it's not cool.
Well, it depends on how painful it is, and then you learn the lesson. I actually embraced the fact that I'll never learn the lesson with vodka. Every time I drink, especially with Russians, it's like I quit drinking every time, and then I forget. There's like a slow drop off. It'll be like 2 weeks, and then
Nazdarovia.
Very good. So it never makes me feel good. It never results in anything good, except the beautiful social chaos.
Yeah,
which is ultimately somehow. There's value to chaos too.
Yes.
You know, there's value to that. Whatever the hell stupid stuff you do when you get trashed, the over the top emotion of love usually or whatever, camaraderie. There's value to that too. Like as I get older, I realize because the world sometimes, especially when you get older, and the world wants you to be an adult. In order to maintain the youthful spirit, you have to use all the tools you can.
Yeah.
And alcohol is one of them.
Right.
To do all the stupid shit you can, even if you're like getting older.
To lower the inhibitions and again, it's that taste of uncertainty that is the sweetness of life, right? To be able to go out and be a flaneur at a party and not really know what you're going to do. And it's, we have this draw to the wild side of life. As much as we try and build up order around ourselves, I think there's always going to be an appetite for that. Most of my life, I've always been a social drinker, but I actually gave up alcohol a year ago. And I would add that to the idea, the repertoire for dealing with bigger ideas, because alcohol's fun. It's good times. It can be analgesic. It can do it can give you all these benefits if used in the right amounts. But I got to the point personally where I was trying to wrestle with these ideas that are just so much bigger than me, and I have this backlog of books that was growing faster than I could read them, that I just reached a point where I decided I wanted to start making sacrifices toward attaining that. And alcohol was just an easy one. You spend, even if you just drink socially on the weekends, you're probably spending 5 to 10 hours drinking, and then maybe another 5 to 10 hours recovering, perhaps on the day after. So it was a difficult transition initially, but once you get through a couple of months, I feel amazing without it. I sleep better than ever. My workouts are better than ever. I'm sharper than ever. I'm more lucid. So I'm not trying to be a proponent for not drinking, but I just want to say.
But you're a proponent for sacrifice.
I am a big proponent for sacrifice.
People love hearing about what brilliant folks like yourself could recommend in terms of books. Of course, you're an author of many books, so I'll in the introduction mention all the books you've written. People should definitely read Live Wired. I've gotten a chance to read some of it. It's amazing. But is there 3 books, technical, fiction, philosophical, that had an impact on you when you were younger or today, and books perhaps some of which you would want to recommend that others read?
As an undergraduate, I majored in British and American literature. That was my major because I love literature. I grew up with literature. My father had these extensive bookshelves, and so I grew up in the mountains in New Mexico, and so that was mostly where I spent my time, was reading books. But I love Faulkner, Hemingway. I love many South American authors, Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Italo Calvino. I would actually recommend Invisible Cities. I loved that book
by
Italo Calvino. Sorry, it's a book of fiction. Anthony Doerr wrote a book called All the Light We Cannot See, which actually was inspired by Incognito, by exactly what we were talking about earlier, about how you can only see a little bit of what we call visible light in the electromagnetic radiation. I wrote about this in Incognito, and then he reviewed Incognito for the Washington Post.
That's awesome.
And then he wrote this book called, the book has nothing to do with that, but that's where the title comes from.
Yeah.
All the Light We Cannot See is about the rest of the spectrum. But that's an absolutely gorgeous book.
That's a book of fiction.
Yeah, it's a book of fiction. Won the Pulitzer Prize.
What's it about?
It takes place during World War II, about these 2 young people, one of whom is blind.
Anything else? So you mentioned Hemingway.
I mean,
Old Man and the Sea. What's your favorite?
Snows of Kilimanjaro. It's a collection of short stories that I love. As far as nonfiction goes, I grew up with Cosmos, both watching the PBS series and then reading the book, and that influenced me a huge amount in terms of what I do. From the time I was a kid, I felt like I want to be Carl Sagan. Like that's what I loved. And in the end, I just, I studied space physics for a while as an undergrad, but then in my last semester, discovered neuroscience and I just thought, wow, I'm hooked on that.
So the Carl Sagan of the brain.
Is
the aspiration.
Yeah.
I mean, you're doing an incredible, maybe a bit of a fun question. What 3 books, technical, fiction, philosophical, you've enjoyed, had a big impact in your life?
Well, I guess I go back to like my teen years, and I read Siddhartha, which is a philosophical book, and kind of helps keep me centered
By
about
Hermann
like not
Hesse.
getting, by Hermann Hesse, exactly. Don't get too wrapped up in material things or other things, and just sort of try to find peace on things. A book that actually influenced me a lot in terms of my career was called The Worldly Philosophers by Robert Heilbrenner. It's actually about economists. It goes through a series of different economists, written in a very lively form. And it probably sounds boring, but it did describe whether it's Adam Smith or Karl Marx or John Maynard Keynes, and each of them sort of what their key insights were, but also kind of their personalities. And I think that's one of the reasons I became an economist was just understanding how they grapple with the big questions of the world.
So would you recommend it as a good whirlwind overview of the history of economics?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. It kind of takes you through the different things, and so you can understand how they reach thinking, some of the strengths and weaknesses. I mean, probably is a little out of date now. It needs to be updated a bit, but you could at least look through the first couple hundred years of economics, which is not a bad place to start. More recently, I mean, a book I really enjoyed is by my friend and colleague Max Tegmark, called Life 3.0. You should have him on your podcast if you haven't already.
He was episode number 1.
Oh my God!
And he's back. He'll be back. He'll be back soon.
Yeah, no, he's terrific. I love the way his brain works, and he makes you think about profound things. He's got such a joyful approach to life. And so that's been a great book, and I learn a lot from it. I think everybody, but he explains it in a way, even though he's so brilliant, that everyone can understand, that I can understand. That's 3, but let me mention maybe 1 or 2 others. I mean, I recently read More from Less by my sometimes co-author Andrew McAfee. Mm-hmm. It made me optimistic about how we can continue to have rising living standards while living more lightly on the planet. In fact, because of higher living standards, because of technology, because of digitization that I mentioned, we don't have to have as big an impact on the planet. And that's a great story to tell, and he documents it very carefully. A personal kind of self-help book that I found kind of useful, people, is Atomic Habits. I think it's, what's his name? James Clear.
Yeah, James Clear.
He's just, it's a good name because he writes very clearly. And, most of the sentences I read in that book, I was like, yeah, I know that. But it just really helps to have somebody like remind you and tell you and kind of just reinforce it.
So build habits in your life that you hope to have that have a positive impact, and don't have to make it big things. It could be just tiny little.
Exactly. I mean, the word atomic, it's a little bit of a pun. I think he says, one, atomic means they're really small. You take these little things, but also like atomic power, it can have big impact.
That's funny. Yeah. Is there books or movies in your life, long ago or recently, that were inspiring, had an impact on you, that you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. So many that I just don't know where to start with it. So I love reading. I read obsessively. I've been reading fiction and a little bit of nonfiction, but mostly fiction obsessively since I was a child, and just never stopped. So I have some favorite books. None of them are easy reading. So I recommend them for somebody who likes an intellectual challenge in the books that they read. So maybe I should go chronologically. I have at least 3. Okay. I'm not going to go through 50 here, but
yeah, I'd love to also maybe ideas that you took away from the ones you mentioned.
Yeah, why they were so compelling to me. One of the first books that really captured my fascination was Nabokov's book Pale Fire.
Oh, wow.
Are you familiar with it?
Yeah.
So I read it actually for a class. It's one of the few books I've ever read for a class that I actually really liked. And the book it's in some sense a puzzle. He's a brilliant writer, of course, but the book is like, it's formatted like a poem. So there's an introduction, a very long poem, and footnotes. And you get partway through it before realizing that the whole thing is actually a novel, unless you sort of read up on it going in. But the whole thing is a novel, and there's a story that slowly reveals itself over the course of all of this, and kind of reveals this just fascinating character, basically, and how his mind works in this story. The idea of a novel also being a kind of intellectual puzzle and something that slowly reveals itself over the course of reading was really fascinating to me, and I have since found a lot more writers like that. A contemporary example that comes to mind is Kazuo Ishiguro, who's pretty much all of his books are like slow reveals over the course of the book, and like nothing much happens in the books, but you keep reading them because you just want to know like what the reality is that he's slowly revealing to you. The kind of discovery-oriented reading, maybe.
Mm-hmm. What's the second one?
Perhaps my favorite writer is Rainer Maria Rilke.
Wow.
Are you familiar
also
with
not
him?
Familiar. You're hitting ones. I mean, I know Nabokov well, but I've never read Pale Fire. But Rilke, I've never. I know it's a very difficult read. I know that much.
Yeah, right. All of these are difficult reads. I think I read in part for an intellectual challenge. But Rilke, so he wrote one thing that might be characterizable as a novel, but he wrote a lot of poetry. He wrote this series of poems called the Duino Elegies that were very impactful for me personally, just emotionally. Which actually, it kind of ties in with astronomy, in that there's a sense, in which we're all going through our lives alone, and there's just this sense of kind of profound loneliness in the existence of every individual human. And I think I was drawn to astronomy in part because the sort of vast spaces, the kind of loneliness and desolateness of space made the sort of internal loneliness feel okay, in a sense. It like gave companionship, and that's how I feel about Rilke's poetry. He turns the kind of desolation and loneliness of human existence into something joyful and almost meaningful.
Yeah, there's something about melancholy. I don't know about Rilke in general, but like contemplating the melancholy nature of the human condition that makes it okay. Like I tend to, from an engineering perspective, think that there is so much loneliness we haven't explored within ourselves yet. And that's my hope, is to build AI systems that help us explore our own loneliness. I think that's kind of what love is, and friendship is somebody who, in a very small way, helps us explore our own loneliness. Like they listen. We connect, like two lonely creatures connect for a time. And it's like, oh, like acknowledge that we exist together, like for a brief time. But in a somewhat shallow way, I think, relative to how much it's possible to truly connect as two consciousnesses. So AI might be able to help on that front. So what's the third one?
Actually, I hadn't realized it until this moment, but it's yet another one of these kind of slow reveal books. It's a contemporary Russian-American writer named Olga Grushin, Grushin. Okay. And she wrote this just phenomenal book called The Dream Life of Sukhanov that I read this year, maybe it was last year for the first time. And it's just a really beautiful... This one you could call a character study, I think, of a Russian father coming to terms with himself and his own past as he potentially slowly loses his mind. I know
Slow reveal. Slow reveal of a.
Well, that's apparent from the beginning. I don't think it's a spoiler.
Decline into madness. Spoiler alert.
So all of these are really heavy. I don't know. I don't have anything lighter to recommend.
Well,
Ishiguro's the light version of this.
Okay. Oh, well, heavy has a certain kind of beauty to it in itself. Oh. What book or books, technical or fiction or philosophical, had when you look back at your life, had a big impact? Maybe was a turning point, was inspiring in some way. Maybe we're talking about some silly book that nobody in their right mind would want to read, or maybe it's a book that you would recommend to others to read, or maybe those could be two different recommendations that of books that could be useful for people on their journey.
When I was it's kind of a personal story. When I was in 12th grade, I got my hands on a PDF copy in Romania of Russell Norvig, AI Modern Approach. I didn't know anything about AI at that point. I had watched the movie The Matrix. was my exposure. And so I started going through this thing. And, you were asking in the beginning, what are it's math and it's algorithms, what's interesting. It was so captivating. This notion that you could just have a goal and figure out your way through a kind of a messy, complicated situation. So what sequence of decisions you should make to autonomously to achieve that goal. That was so cool. I'm biased, but that's a cool book.
Yeah,
to look at.
You can convert, the goal of the process of intelligence and mechanize it. I had the same experience. I was really interested in psychiatry and trying to understand human behavior, and then AI and modern approach is wait, you can just reduce it all to.
You can write math about human behavior, right? Yeah. So and I think that stuck with me because a lot of what we do in my lab is write math about human behavior, combine it with data and learning, put it all together, give it to robots to plan with, and, hope that instead of writing rules for the robots, writing heuristics, designing behavior, they can actually autonomously come up with the right thing to do around people. That's kind of that's our signature move. We wrote some math, and then instead of kind of handcrafting this and that, the robot figured stuff out. And isn't that cool? And I think that is the same enthusiasm that I got from the robot figured out how to reach that goal in that graph. Isn't that cool?
Let me ask a question I think people are curious about when they look at a world-class leader and thinker such as yourself, as what books, technical, fiction, philosophical, had a big impact on your life, and maybe from another perspective, what books would you recommend others read?
So my choice, the 3 books, right?
3 books.
My choice is so the one book that really influenced me a lot when I was starting out this company maybe 10 years ago was GEB. Got a Lesher Bach. And I like everything about it, first of all. It's just beautifully written, and it's so old school and so somewhat outdated a little bit. But I think the ideas in it about the fact that a few meaningless components can come together and create meaning that we can't even understand.
So this emergent thing, complexity, the whole science of complexity. And that beauty, intelligence, all interesting things about this world emerge.
Yeah, and phenomena. Yeah, the Gödel theorems, and just thinking about what even these even all these formal systems, something can be created that we can't quite yet understand. And that, from my romantic standpoint, was always just that is why it's important to maybe I should try to work on these systems and try to build an AI. Yes, I'm not an engineer. Yes, I don't really know how it works. But I think that something comes out of it that's, pure poetry. And I know a little bit about that. Something magical comes out of it that we can't quite put a finger on. That's why that book was really fundamental for me. Just for, I don't even know why. It was just all about this little magic that happens. So that's one. probably the most important book for Replica was Carl Rogers on Becoming a Person. And that's really, and so I think when I think about our company, it's all about, there's so many little magical things that happened over the course of working on it. For instance, I mean, the most famous chatbot that we learned about when we started working on the company was Eliza, which was Weizenbaum, the MIT professor that built a chatbot that would listen to you and be a therapist.
Yeah.
And I got really inspired to build Replica when I read Carl Rogers on Becoming a Person. And then I realized that Eliza was mocking Carl Rogers. It was Carl Rogers back in the day. But I thought that Carl Rogers' ideas they're simple, and they're not, they're very, very simple, but they're maybe the most profound thing I've ever learned about human beings. And that's the fact that before Carl Rogers, most therapy was about seeing what's wrong with people and trying to fix it or show them what's wrong with you. And it was all built on the fact that all people are fundamentally flawed. We have this, broken psyche, and this is therapy is just an instrument to shed some light on that. And Carl Rogers was different in a way that he finally said that, it's very important for therapy to work is to create this therapeutic relationship where you believe fundamentally in inclination to positive growth, that everyone deep inside wants to grow positively and change. And it's super important to create this space and this therapeutic relationship where you give unconditional positive regard, deep understanding, allowing someone else to be a separate person, full acceptance. And you also try to be as genuine as possible in it. And then for him, that was his own journey of personal growth. And that was back in the 60s. And even that book that is, that's coming from years ago, there's a mention that even machines can potentially do that. And I always felt that, creating this space is probably the biggest gift we can give to each other. And that's why the book was fundamental for me personally, because I felt I want to be learning how to do that in my life. And maybe I can scale it with these AI systems, and other people can get access to that. So I think Carl Rogers, it's a pretty dry and a little bit boring book, but I think
Would
the
you
idea
recommend
is
others
good.
try to read it?
I do. I think just for yourself,
as a human, not as an AI.
As a human, it is just, and for him, that was his own path of growing personally over years, working with people like that. And so it was work and himself growing, helping other people grow and growing through that. And that's fundamentally what I believe in with our work, helping other people growing ourselves, trying to build a company that's all built on these principles, having a good time, allowing some people to work with to grow a little bit. So these two books, and then I would throw in, we have in our office, when we started the company in Russia, we put a neon sign in our office because we thought that's what you recipe for success. Yeah. If we do that, we're definitely going to wake up as a multi-billion-dollar company. And it was the Ludwig Wittgenstein quote, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world."
Well, what's the quote?
"The limits of my language are the limits of my world." And I love the Tractatus. I think it's just a beautiful.
It's a book by Wittgenstein.
Yeah, and I would recommend that too. Even although he himself didn't believe in that by the end of his lifetime and debunked these ideas. But I think I remember once an engineer came in 2012, I think, or 13, a friend of ours who worked with us and then went on to work at DeepMind, and he talked to us about Word2Vec. Mm-hmm. And I saw that, I'm like, wow, that's, they wanted to translate language into, some other representation. And that seems like somehow all of that at some point, I think will come into this one place. Somehow it just all feels like different people think about similar ideas in different times from absolutely different perspectives. And that's why I like these books.
The limits of our language is the limit of our world. On
we still have that neon sign. It's very hard to work with this red light in your face.
Is there books outside of all of this cryptocurrency, sort of technical, fiction, philosophical, that had an impact on your life? because you have interests that are all over the place. Is there something that you would recommend to others?
So Tao of Capital is definitely probably my favorite book. Books that have been impactful. I read when I was 20, actually, sitting in the desert of Iraq, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Think and Grow Rich, and The Richest Man in Babylon. And I don't think I took a single thing and like implemented it from like an execution standpoint, but it was a complete shift in mentality and understanding a relationship with money and just kind of what I wanted to do with my life and stuff like that. So I think those 3 books, and I read them in succession, were really impactful. And then I think one of the best books probably ever written is, I think it's called When Breath Becomes Air, or Air Becomes Breath. I can't remember. But it's basically a doctor or a medical professional who's dying. And he essentially writes about the experience and thoughts and kind of all the stuff. And I think that it's just one of these things where if you said to me, you know, what's the number one thing I took out of my experience in Iraq, that's a book like that also gives you, is we're all going to die, right? And you and I can want to be as immortal as we want, but at some point we're going to die. And so it really does kind of focus you on time being that scarce asset and use it for enjoyment and happiness more so than anything else. And I think that's part of your message, and it's a great one.
Do you like literally meditate on your own mortality?
I don't necessarily think I meditate on it as much as...
Are you afraid of death? Were you afraid of death when you were in Iraq? I mean, coming face to face with it, are you afraid of death today?
No, I think that it was just one of these things where, like, if you fixate on something and you worry about it, then, at least to me, like, you become uneasy about it. And so after an experience like going to war, I think that everything is just so not important compared to that, right? Like when I came back, I remember going back into the college environment and like things people were worried about. I was like, listen, let me explain to you, you know, what the real world's like, right? But I think even today, right, if you talk to people who know me really well, I don't get worked up about a lot of stuff. I don't get, you know, in either direction, good or bad, anything, because ultimately it just comes down to, if that's the final result, let's enjoy it.
People ask, it's an interesting question. Let me know if you have any recommendations. What 3 books, technical or fiction or philosophical, had an impact on your life, or you would recommend perhaps?
Maybe we'll start with the least controversial, Infinite Jest. Infinite Jest is a...
David Foster Wallace.
Yeah, it's a book about wireheading, really. Very enjoyable to read, very well written. You know, you will grow as a person reading this book. It's effort. And I'll set that up for the second book, which is pornography. It's called Atlas Shrugged, which
Atlas Shrugged is pornography.
I mean, it is. I will not I will not say Atlas Shrugged is a well-written book. It is entertaining to read, certainly, just like pornography. The production value isn't great. You know, there's a 60-page monologue in there that Ayn Rand's editor really wanted to take out, and she paid out of her pocket to keep that 60-page monologue in the book. Yeah. But it is a great book for a kind of framework of human relations. And I know a lot of people are like, yeah, but it's a terrible framework. Yeah, but it's a framework.
Just for context, in a couple of days, I'm speaking for probably 4+ hours with Yaron Brook, who's the main remaining objectivist.
Interesting.
So I've always found this philosophy quite interesting on many levels. One of how repulsive large percent of the population find it, which is always funny to me when people are like unable to even read a philosophy because of some. I think that says more about their psychological perspective on it.
Yeah.
But there is something about objectivism and Ayn Rand's philosophy that's very deeply connected to this idea of capitalism, of the ethical life is the productive life. That was always compelling to me. It didn't seem as like I didn't seem to interpret it in the negative sense that some people do.
To be fair, I read that book when I was 19.
So it had an impact at that point. Yeah, true.
Yeah, and the bad guys in the book have this slogan: from each according to their ability to each according to their need. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, these are the most this is Team Rocket level cartoonishness, right? No bad guy. And then when I realized that was actually the slogan of the Communist Party, I'm like, wait a second. Wait, no. You're telling me this really happened?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the criticisms of her work is she has a cartoonish view of good and evil, like that there's like the reality, as Jordan Peterson says, is that each of us have the capacity for good and evil in us, as opposed to like there's some characters who are purely evil and some characters that are purely good.
And that's in a way why it's pornographic.
The production value, I love it.
Well, and evil is punished, and there's very clearly like there's no just like porn doesn't have like character growth. Well, neither does Atlas Shrugged. Like,
brilliant, but, well put. But at 19-year-old George Hotz, it was good enough.
Yeah.
What's the third? You have something?
I could give these two. I'll just throw out. They're sci-fi. Permutation City. Great things to start thinking about copies of yourself, and then
Who's that by? Sorry to interrupt.
That is Greg Egan. That might not be his real name. Some Australian guy. Might not be Australian. I don't know. And then this one's online. It's called The Metamorphosis of Prime Intellect. It's a story set in a post-singularity world. It's interesting.
Is there, if in either of the worlds, do you find something philosophically interesting in them that you can comment on?
I mean, it is clear to me that Metamorphosis of Prime Intellect is like written by an engineer, which is, it's very almost a pragmatic take on a utopia in a way.
Positive or negative?
Well, that's up to you to decide reading the book. And the ending of it is very interesting as well, and I didn't realize what it was. I first read that when I was 15. I've reread that book several times in my life. And it's short. It's 50 pages. Everyone should go read it.
What's sorry, this is a little tangent. I've been working through the foundation. I haven't read much sci-fi my whole life, and I'm trying to fix that the last few months. That's been a little side project. What's to you is the greatest sci-fi novel that people should read? Or is there? Or
I mean, I would say like Permutation City, Metamorphosis of Prime Intellect.
Got it.
I don't know. I didn't like Foundation. I thought it was way too modernist.
Do you like Dune and all of those?
I've never read Dune. I've never read Dune. I have to read it. Fire Upon the Deep is interesting. Okay, I mean, look, everyone should read Neuromancer. Everyone should read Snow Crash. If you haven't read those, like, start there.
I haven't read Snow Crash.
Never read Snow Crash?
No.
It's very entertaining. Go to Lesher Bach, and if you want the controversial one, Bronze Age Mindset.
All right, I'll look into that one.
Those aren't sci-fi, but just to round out books.
So, a bunch of people asked me on Twitter and Reddit and so on for advice. So, what advice would you give a young person today about life? Another way. What? I mean, looking back, especially when you're younger, you did, and you continued it. You've accomplished a lot of interesting things. Is there some advice from that life of yours that you can pass on?
If college ever opens again, I would love to give a graduation speech. At that point, I will put a lot of somewhat satirical effort into this question.
Yeah. You haven't written anything at this point.
Oh, you know what? Always wear sunscreen. This is water. Like,
I think you're plagiarizing.
I mean, but that's the like, clean your room. You can plagiarize from all of this stuff, and it's there is no self-help books aren't designed to help you. They're designed to make you feel good. Like, whatever advice I could give, you already know. Everyone already knows. Yeah. Sorry, it doesn't feel good. Right? Like, you know, what if I tell you that you should, eat well and read more, and it's not going to do anything. I think the whole like genre of those kind of questions is meaningless.
I don't know.
If anything, it's don't worry so much about that stuff. Don't be so caught up in your head.
Right. I mean, in the sense that your whole life, your whole existence is like moving version of that advice. I don't know. There's something, I mean, there's something in you that resists that kind of thinking, and that in itself is just illustrative of who you are. And there's something to learn from that. I think you're clearly not overthinking stuff.
Yeah, and you know
There's
what?
a gut thing.
When I talk about my advice, I'm like, my advice is only relevant to me. It's not relevant to anybody else. I'm not saying you should go out, if you're the kind of person who overthinks things, to stop overthinking things. It's not bad. It doesn't work for me. Maybe it works for you. I don't know.
I don't know if you have a good answer for this, but people love it when I ask this question about books. Are there books in your life that you've enjoyed? Philosophical, fiction, technical, that had a big impact on you as an engineer or as a human being? You know, everything from science fiction to a favorite textbook. Is there 3 books that stand out that you can think of?
3 books. So I would, that impacted me. I would say, and this one is, you probably know it well, but not generally well known. I think in the U.S. or kind of internationally, The Master and Margarita. It's one of actually my favorite books. It is by a Russian. It's a novel by a Russian author, Mikhail Bulgakov, and it's a great book. It's one of those books that you can like reread your entire life, and it's very accessible. You can read it as a kid, and like the plot is interesting. It's the devil visiting the Soviet Union, and but it like you read it, reread it at different stages of your life, and you enjoy it for very different reasons, and you keep finding like deeper and deeper meaning, and it kind of affected, definitely had an like imprint on me, mostly from the probably kind of the cultural stylistic aspect. Like it makes you one of those books that is good and makes you think, but also has like this really silly, quirky, dark sense of humor.
Yeah, it captures the Russian soul more than perhaps many other books. On that like slight note, just out of curiosity, one of the saddest things is I've read that book in English. Did you by chance read it in English or in Russian?
In Russian, only in Russian. And I actually, that is a question I had kind of posed to myself every once in a while. Like, I wonder how well it translates, if it translates at all. And there's the language aspect of it, and then there's the cultural aspect. So I'm not sure if either of those would work well in English.
Now I forget their names, but so when the COVID lifts a little bit, I'm traveling to Paris. For several reasons. One is just I've never been to Paris. I want to go to Paris. But there's the most famous translators of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, of most of Russian literature live there. There's a couple. They're famous, a man and a woman. And I'm going to sort of have a series of conversations with them. And in preparation for that, I'm starting to read Dostoevsky in Russian. So I'm really embarrassed to say that I've read everything I've read of Russian literature of like serious depth has been in English. Even though I can also read, I mean, obviously in Russian, but for some reason it seemed in the optimization of life, it seemed the improper decision to read in Russian. Like, like I don't need to I need to think in English, not in Russian. But now I'm changing my mind on that. And so the question of how well it translates is a really fundamental one. Like even with Dostoevsky. So from what I understand, Dostoevsky translates easier. Others don't as much. Obviously the poetry doesn't translate as well. I'm also the music, big fan of Vladimir Vysotsky. He doesn't obviously translate well. People have tried. But Master Margaret, I don't know. I don't know about that one. I just know it in English, and it was fun as hell in English. So, but it's a curious question, and I want to study it rigorously from both the machine learning aspect and also because I want to do a couple of interviews in Russia that I'm still unsure of how to properly conduct an interview across a language barrier? It's a fascinating question that ultimately communicates to an American audience. There's a few Russian people that I think are truly special human beings. And I feel like I sometimes encounter this with some incredible scientists, and maybe you encounter this as well at some point in your life, that it feels like because of the language barrier, their ideas are lost to history. It's a sad thing. I think about like Chinese scientists or even authors that we don't, in an English speaking world, don't get to appreciate some like the depth of the culture because it's lost in translation. And I feel like I would love to show that to the world. Like I'm just some idiot, but because I have this, like at least some semblance of skill in speaking Russian, I feel like, and I know how to record stuff on a video camera. I feel like I want to catch like Grigory Perelman, who's a mathematician. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. Mm-hmm. I want to talk to him. Like he's a fascinating mind, and to bring him to a wider audience in English speaking will be fascinating. But that requires to be rigorous about this question of how well Bulgakov translates. I mean, I know it's a silly concept, but it's a fundamental one, because how do you translate? And that's the thing that Google Translate is also facing, as a more machine learning problem. But I wonder, as a more bigger problem for AI, how do we capture the magic that's there in the language?
I think that's a really interesting, really challenging problem. If you do read it, Master and Margarita in in Russian, I'd be curious to get your opinion. And I think part of it is language, but part of it's just centuries of culture that the cultures are different, so it's hard to connect that. But, okay, so that was my first one, right? You had two more. The second one, I would probably pick the science fiction by the Strugatsky brothers. Mm-hmm. It's up there with Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury and company. The Strugatsky brothers kind of appealed more to me. I think it made more of an impression on me growing up. I
apologize if I'm showing my complete ignorance. I'm so weak on sci-fi. What do they write?
Roadside Picnic. Hard to Be a God. Beetle in an anthill. Monday Starts on Saturday. Like it's not just science fiction. It's also like has very interesting, interpersonal and societal questions, and some of the language is just completely hilarious.
Понедельник начинается в субботу.
That's
That's
right.
the one.
That's right.
Oh, interesting. Monday starts on Saturday. So I need to read. Okay. Oh boy, you put that in the category of science fiction.
That one is, this was more of a silly, humorous work. There is kind of,
but it's profound too, right?
It's science fiction, right? It's about this research institute, and like it has deep parallels to like serious research, but the setting, of course, is that they're working on magic, right? And there's a lot of so and that's their style, right? They go and other books are very different, right? Hard to Be a God, right? It's about kind of this higher society being injected into this primitive world and how they operate there, like some of the very deep ethical questions there, right? And like they've got this full spectrum. Some is more about kind of more adventure style, but like I enjoy all of their books. There's probably a couple, actually one I think that they considered their most important work. I think it's The Snail on a Hill. I don't know exactly how it translates. I tried reading a couple of times. I still don't get it, but everything else I fully enjoyed. And like for one of my birthdays as a kid, I got like their entire collection, like occupied a giant shelf in my room. And then like over the holidays, I just like, my parents couldn't drag me out of the room, and I read the whole thing cover to cover, and I really enjoyed it. And that's the one more. For the third one, maybe a little bit darker, but comes to mind is Orwell's 1984. And you asked what made an impression on me and the books that people should read. That one I think falls in the category of both. Definitely is one of those books that read and you just kind of put it down and you stare in space for a while. That kind of work. I think there's lessons there people should not ignore, and nowadays with like everything that's happening in the world, I can't help it but have my mind jump to some parallels with what Orwell described, and like this whole concept of double think and ignoring logic and holding completely contradictory opinions in your mind and not have that not bother you, and sticking to the party line at all costs. Like there's something there.
If anything, 2020 has taught me, and I'm a huge fan of Animal Farm, which is a kind of friendly, as a friend of 1984 by Orwell. It's kind of another thought experiment of how our society may go in directions that we wouldn't like it to go. But if anything, that's been kind of heartbreaking to an optimist about 2020 is that society is kind of fragile. Like we have this is a special little experiment we have going on, and it's not unbreakable. Like we should be careful to like preserve whatever special thing we have going on. I mean, I think 1984 and these books, Brave New World, they're helpful in thinking like stuff can go wrong in non-obvious ways, and it's like it's up to us to preserve it. And it's like it's a responsibility. It's been weighing heavy on me because like for some reason like more than my mom follows me on Twitter, and I feel like I have like now somehow a responsibility to this world, and it dawned on me that like me and millions of others are like the little ants that maintain this little colony, right? So we have a responsibility not to be I don't know what the right analogy is, but I'll put a flamethrower to the place. We want to not do that. And there's interesting, complicated ways of doing that, as 1984 shows. It could be through bureaucracy, it could be through incompetence, it could be through misinformation, it could be through division and toxicity. I'm a huge believer in like that love will be somehow the solution. So love and robots.
Love and robots, yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. Unfortunately, I think it's less of a flamethrower type of exercise. I think it's more of in many cases, can be more of a slow boil, right? And that's the danger.
People love it when I ask about book recommendations in general. Of course, your journey is just beginning, but is there something that jumps out to you? Technical, fiction, philosophical, sci-fi, coloring books, blog posts you read somewhere that had an impact on your life?
Video games.
Video games that you recommend to others. Minecraft, a manual.
Manga.
I mean, yeah, you could mention video games too. If there's something that jumps out to you that just had like an impact.
I guess I'll say I really like the book, The War of Art, which is a book about creative resistance and the creative struggle and what it means to be creative.
Yeah.
And part of what I see in this conversation and what you're doing, Lex, is so much of the War of Art's idea is that you just keep writing and writing and writing until you get to the new crap.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
yeah.
you just roll with it, right? And that's sort of what happens when you have like 3-hour conversations with people is you can only have so much scripted or societally constructed stuff until you get to the real you.
And you have to show up. I mean, that book is kind of painful.
It's really painful. And it's not something I would recommend for every part of it, but for what it did in my life at the time, it also kind of normalized, I don't know. Part of my coming of age story is part of it's about realizing that I'm a creative person and person who needs to create. That's sort of a God-given thing, I think, for a lot of people, but it's something that I don't really feel like I can live without. And part of it was realizing that even within some of these more rigid structures, it's okay that I don't sort of fit in with them. And to hear about the struggles of other creatives was something for my own self-esteem and my own growing up that was really important to me. So I don't think the book itself might be perfect, but for what it did for my life, it was really impactful.
Yeah, I think exactly. The words may not be exactly right by way of advice, but I think the journey that a lot of creatives take by reading that book is kind of profound. He also has another one called Turning Pro, I think. I mean, he in general espouses like taking it seriously. Like, if you have a creative mind and you want to create something special in this world, go do it. It's not, don't, show up
and so many
look at
people,
the blank page.
So many people would like tell me, like, would encourage me either blatantly or through like implicit means to like basically take the app less seriously. It's a good signal, by the way. It's a good signal because my really close friends, the ones who have always supported me, they never said that because they got it. They understood that was my path. And they might be skeptical. They might be like, I mean, one of my friends I remember told me, like, I was always like taken aback about why you were so certain this would work out. And he's like, I finally got it, like, once I saw it like popping off, but like before that I just didn't get it. But like he still supported me. And I think it's a really good signal. And actually, just the fact of going through this process has made me socially feel so much more connected. And I've somewhat consolidated my social life to some degree, but it's so much more vulnerable, connected. And that's part of the creative process. I have to thank for that, I think.
There's something that's like unstoppable about the creative mind. It's like, it's right there, that fire. And I guess part of the thing that you're supposed to do is let that fire burn in whichever direction.
And it's going to hurt.
It's going to hurt. Fire will hurt. But on the topic of video games, you mentioned Stanley Parable offline. Is there, you said you played some video games. Is there a video game that you especially love that you recommend I play, for example?
Yeah, I'll mention, it's actually really in keeping with what we've been talking about. It's The Beginner's Guide, which is it was made by the same guy, Davey Rendon, who made the Stanley Parable, which I briefly saw you. I just clicked the video and then I went to sleep. It was like 2 a.m. And then, but I briefly saw that you were looking at, and it's a game that is better treated as art. And I think, I won't claim to understand the creator because that would be a cardinal sin to me as a creative person. But it gets to the heart of a lot of the things that we've been that we've been talking about, which is the creative mind. The game can be interpreted in a lot of ways. In a feminist way, it could be interpreted as a story of friends. It could be interpreted as the story of critics versus a creative. The way I like to interpret it, and I don't want to give away too much, is the story of the creative part of your mind that creates just for the sake of creating, meaning the part that creates for no rhyme or reason or clear meaning. It's almost ethereal, versus the part that's, you could call it the editor, you could call it the pragmatist, you could call it the necessary force of ego in our lives. We can't totally be egoless, right? But we need to be egoless to be creative. And how that sort of internal censure, what role does it play? And how do we allow our creative minds to be creative? And yet, how do we still become useful? Because, and it's funny that a video game, right, could have this in.
It's a fascinating tension. Are there books, technical fiction, philosophical, that had an impact on your life that you recommend, or even resources like blogs, films?
Yeah. I have 4 books I'll briefly mention. Number 1 is The Fear. The Fear had a deep impact on me. The Fear was written by Peter Godwin. It's about the systematic dismantling of Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. Peter's Zimbabwean, and it is a riveting book. I think everyone should read it because it helps you understand what it's like to go through not just authoritarianism, but also hyperinflation. And I mean, really, at the end of the day, what The Fear describes is how Mugabe took this country in the 1980s, and he actually brought it back in time to the 1920s in terms of infrastructure, literacy rates, health rates, all these things. He stole so much from the people. And it's a heartbreaking book, but it's a very important book. And it's a way to do excellent journalism. So The Fear is a good one.
And it's a personal story?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because it's part of his whole family story, and he's in there. He's interviewing people personally. So I would say that one.
Is it also connected? And sorry to interrupt. Is it from the inflation perspective? Is it a good study of hyperinflation and the effects? Does Bitcoin at all come as a
no,
a discussion of money? does that come into or is it purely the experience of inflation is almost a symptom of an authoritarian government?
A little bit. I would say it's not deep. I have another book on that, which I'll recommend in a second. But I would just say that it's a very powerfully written book about how society can basically deteriorate and how you can lose everything. The second book is, I just mentioned it, but The Man Without a Face by Masha Gessen. Incredible book about modern Russia and Putin. Just a masterpiece. So that
would be one of your favorite books about Putin and Russia.
That one's the best. I mean, she's just so fearless, incredible. She interviews Putin in the book at the end. It's really good. Third one is a fiction book called The Mandibles, written by Lionel Shriver. This one's good. It's a good gift book. It's funny. It's dark. It's witty. But it's about the United States losing its status as the reserve currency and going into hyperinflation. And what's interesting is that the characters in the book map where we are today. The book itself is about the late 2020s. And we have a populist president who decides to announce that the United States is like basically going to default on its debts. And the rest of the world comes up with like a new currency and everybody switches to that one. And the dollar like overnight becomes worthless. And all these like economists are saying, no, it's fine. Like inflation won't be a problem. And there's this one character who's like an economist. And he gets to the point where he's living as a refugee in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and he's still saying everything's fine, So it's like, it's dry, it's witty, but it's also about the surveillance state. It's about centralization of power. It's really good. So The Mandibles, I would highly recommend. So those three books. And then on the topic of Bitcoin, because we talked about it a lot, I would just say that my portal into Bitcoin was The Internet of Money by Andreas Antonopoulos.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I did it by audiobook. And I just think this is an important one for people to start with because he goes through all the main concepts, whether it be proof of work or, how the network functions. But he does it in a way that's extremely engaging and really fascinating. And it really just kind of like sparked my curiosity.
Is it discussing the technical sides or also the philosophical? Because a lot of people mention sort of the Bitcoin standard as the philosophical entry into the whole Bitcoin world.
Very different from the Bitcoin standard. It's more for like the average person. It's not a history book. It's a collection of his talks that he gave over like 2 or 3 years. It's not very technical. It's very approachable.
Yeah.
And some of it might be dated now because it's like 2015, 2016. But I mean,
it's great. It's great to hear a shout out for Andreas because he seems to be one of the seminal figures to sort of make Bitcoin ideas accessible.
Oh, Andreas is the GOAT.
He's the
Andreas is the GOAT.
Andreas is the GOAT.
I know a lot of people will have issues with some of his like more recent work, but Andreas is the GOAT. I mean, he's the reason I'm in Bitcoin. I mean, he's the reason I'm in Bitcoin. So
yeah, that's fascinating. It's funny. It's funny to watch the Bitcoin maximalist immune system also attacking him, and this whole feedback mechanism is working together. It's fascinating.
Well, I probably consider myself a maximalist, but I really like Andreas. So I think there's room for nuance.
Yeah, there's room for nuance in this world. I'm glad to hear that. If people are fascinated by your work, what is the way to get more of Alex?
So 2 years ago, I came together with 7 other people from around the world, and we wrote a book in a book sprint. We lived in a house for 4 days. We wrote a book together. It was really cool. It's like a design sprint, but we did it in book format. And my co-authors are from Nigeria, Venezuela, the Philippines, from former Soviet Union, from all over. And it's called The Little Bitcoin Book, and I'm still proud of it. It's 100 pages. It's something you give to somebody who knows nothing about the topic. And it's not a technical book. It's about the sort of social, political aspect of it. Like, why is it important for you, for your finances, for your freedom, for your future? And we've translated it into like a lot of languages by now. I think English, Spanish, and Portuguese are for sale. And at littlebitcoinbook.com, you go buy it. But we've made it as a free PDF in Mandarin, Hindi, Punjab, Korean, Uyghur, which I was really excited about, Arabic, Farsi. Yeah. And I mean, it spreads, man. It's been really, really cool. So I'm proud of that. I also made a video that did very well for Reason magazine called Why is Bitcoin Protecting Human Rights Around the World? Mm-hmm. It's 5 minutes. And I feel like I tried to boil everything that I want to tell you into this 5-minute video. So there's that. Would recommend that. And then if you're interested in the why have governments not stopped it, which I think is really intriguing. I wrote this long essay in Quillette in February called, why haven't governments banned Bitcoin? And maybe that'll be a helpful guide to some folks.
Is it speaking to the Trojan horse idea that there's something enticing about it?
Yeah, at the end, it does get into that, but it really also just kind of goes through technically, why is it hard to do a 51% attack? Like,
gotcha.
Like if a government wanted to, could it really get all that equipment? There's a semiconductor shortage. Like it can't. Like there's like certain things that stop governments from doing it, right? And same thing with like this idea of a 6102, which would be based on the idea of the Executive Order 6102, which is from 1933 when FDR made holding gold illegal in the United States. Mm-hmm. The idea is that like banks would go around now with governments and try to like steal everybody's Bitcoin. Well, in Bitcoin, we have like a practice called Proof of Keys Day every January 3rd, which is coinciding with the launch of the Bitcoin blockchain, where we all like withdraw our keys from exchanges and we be sovereign users. What we are doing is we are preparing for a 6102 attack, which will one day probably come, right? So the essay just goes through all of the like possible attacks, and it runs through like the ones that happened, like the Chinese and Indian governments, the two largest governments in the world, both tried to attack Bitcoin by banning their citizens from exchanging fiat for Bitcoin. It didn't work. Interest instead exploded. It's like the Barbra Streisand effect, where by making something public and saying you shouldn't do X, it actually increases attention about X a lot more, right? So I think there's a lot of interesting game theory there that people...
We've mentioned a lot of books throughout this conversation. Mm-hmm. I wonder, and this makes me really curious to explore in a lot of depth the kind of books that you're interested in. I think you mentioned in your show that you provide recommendations.
Yes, I do.
In the form of spoken word. Mm-hmm. Can you, beyond what we've already recommended, mention books, whether it is historical, nonfiction, or whether it's more like philosophical or even fiction that had a big impact on your life? Is there a few that you can mention?
Sure. I already talked about the Johnson book, so I'll leave that alone. Robert A. Caro, he's still alive, thank God. He's finishing the last book. I hope he makes it. So those Johnson books. Second...
Can I ask you a question about those books?
Yes.
What the hell do you fit into so many pages?
Everything, man. Let me tell you this. So I'll just give it an anecdote. This is why I love these books. The beginning, the first book is about Lyndon Johnson.
Yes.
His life to when he gets elected to Congress. The book begins with a history of Texas and its weather patterns, and then of his great-great-grandfather moving to Texas.
Yes.
Then the story of that. About 100 or so pages in, you get to Lyndon Johnson. Yes. That's how you do it.
Okay.
Which is
so it's like a Tolstoy style retelling.
This is the thing. It's not a biography. It's a story of the times. That's a great biography. So another one, this isn't part of my list, so don't is
right.
Grant.
Off the record.
Ron Chernow. Ron Chernow's Grant. It's 1,000 pages. And the reason I tell everybody to read it is it's not just the story of Grant. It is the story of pre-Civil War America, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, all told in the life of one person who was involved in all three. Most people don't know anything about the Mexican-American War. It's fascinating. Most people don't know anything about Reconstruction. Now more so because people are talking, it's a hot topic now. I've been reading about it for years. That is another thing people need to learn a lot more about. In terms of non-history books, the book that probably had the most impact on me, which is also it's historical nonfiction, is I am obsessed with Antarctic exploration. And it all began with a book called Shackleton's Incredible Journey, which is the collection of diaries of everybody who was on Shackleton's journey. For those who don't know, Shackleton was the last explorer of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. He led a ship called the Endurance, which froze in the ice off the coast of Antarctica in 1914. And they didn't have radios. They were the last exploration, a last one without the age of radio. And he happens to freeze in the ice. And then the ship collapses after a year, frozen in the ice. And this man leads his entire crew from that ship onto the ice with a team of dogs, survives out on the ice for another year with 3 little lifeboats, and is able to get all of his men, every single one of them alive, to an island hundreds of miles away called Elephant Island. And when they got there, he had to leave everybody behind except for 6 people. And him and 2 other guys, I'm forgetting their names, navigated by the stars 800 miles through the Drake Passage with seas of hundreds of feet to I think it's called Prince George's Island.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they got to Prince George's Island, they landed on the wrong side and they had to hike from one side to the other to go and meet the whalers. And every single one of those things was supposed to be impossible. Nobody was ever supposed to hike that island. It wasn't done again until like the 1980s with professional equipment.
Mm-hmm.
He did it after 2 years of starvation. Nobody was ever supposed to make it from Elephant Island to Prince George. The guy, they had to hold him steady, his legs, so that he could chart the stars. And if they miss this island, they're into open sea. They're dead. And then before that, how do you survive for a year on the ice?
Yeah.
On seals. And before that, he kept his crew from depression, frozen 1 year in the ice. It's just an amazing story. And it made me obsessed with Antarctic exploration. So I've read like 15 books on.
What the hell is it about the human spirit?
It's amazing. That's the thing about Antarctica is it brings it out of you. So for example, I read another one recently called Mawson's Will. Douglas Mawson. He was an Australian. He was on one of the first Robert Frost expeditions. He leads an expedition down to the south. Him and a partner, they're leading explorations. 1908, something like that.
Yes.
They're going around Antarctica with dog teams. And what happens is they keep going over these snow bridges where there's a crevice, but it's covered in snow.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the lead driver, the dogs go over and they plummet. And that sled takes with it. So the guy survives, but that sled takes all their food, half the dogs, their stove, the camping tent, the tent specifically designed for the snow, everything.
Mm-hmm.
And they're hundreds of miles away from base camp. He and this guy have to make it back there in time before the ship comes to come get them on an agreed upon date. And he makes it. But the guy he was with, he dies. And it's a crazy story. They have, first of all, they have to eat the dogs. A really creepy part of Antarctic exploration is everyone ends up eating dogs at different points.
Yeah.
And part of the theory, which is so crazy, is that the guy he was with was dying because they were eating dog liver. And dog liver has a lot of vitamin E, which if you eat too much of it can give you like a poisoning. And so Mawson, by trying to help his friend, was giving him more
Of
liver.
all the things that kills you.
I know, is dog liver. And so his friend ends up dying, have a horrific heart attack, all of that. Mawson crawls back hundreds of miles away, makes it back to base camp hours after the ship leaves. And 2 guys or a couple of guys stayed behind for him. And he basically has to recuperate for like 6 months before he can even walk again. But it's like you were saying about the human spirit. It's like Antarctica brings that out of people. Or Amundsen, the guy who made it to the South Pole, Robert Amundsen. Oh my God. Like this guy trained his whole life in the ice from Norway to make it to the South Pole. And he beat Robert Frost, the British guy with all this money and all these. I could go on this forever. I'm obsessed with Antarctica.
Well, first of all, I'm gonna take this part of the podcast.
Yeah.
I'm gonna set it to music.
Yeah.
I'm gonna listen to it because I've been whining and bitching about running 48 miles with Goggins this next weekend, and this is gonna be so easy. I'm just gonna listen to this over and over in my head. You're gonna be. Let me ask you about books and movies. What books and movies in your life long ago, when you were baby Sergey, or today, had an impact on you? Maybe you would recommend to others, and maybe what ideas you took away from those books, movies, coloring books, children's books, blogs, whatever.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that had a very big impact on me were Plato's dialogues, and particularly Protagoras and Gorgias as some of the 2 initial ones. I think what Plato's dialogues do very well is they give people a clear picture of what dialogue looks like and what the assessment of information probably should look like, right? And how the dissection and analysis of an idea is very important, and how it can actually be taken in either direction. But at the end of the day, that the process of eliminating kind of this fuzzy thinking and arriving at whether it's an external dialogue or an internal dialogue about an accurate picture of reality is actually very important. And so I think I'm very lucky to have read the dialogues when I was in my early teenage years, and it had a very large impact on me because it kind of showed me that, you know, nobody knows what they're talking about. I would play out dialogues in my mind, and I would engage in certain dialogues with different people. And what, you know, the Platonic dialogue showed me was kind of how to tell when someone has no clue. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are very good at kind of saying they have a clue, right? Saying like, here is how the world works. Here's what you should do with your life. Here's what you should do with your time. Here's what you should do with your money. Here's what you should do with your attention. Mm-hmm. Here's what you should do with all these things. And I think the ability to evaluate information generally is something that is surprisingly under-taught. I don't actually understand why there isn't a course in like high schools or universities that's just like, here is how you evaluate information. Here's how you engage in external dialogue and internal dialogue to arrive at an accurate picture of reality rather than the picture of reality that other people want you to have for their benefit most often, right? And at the end of the day, I think that put me down a path to really try and understand. Beyond that, I think biographies have had a very large impact on me. You know, Plutarch's Greek and Roman lives. After I read Plato, I started reading a bunch of stuff, Greek stuff. I was just like, these Greek guys, they really know how it is. You know, they did this 2,000 years ago and they still got it right. There's something here. It's kind of this like theory of time around the value of intellectual ideas, right? If an intellectual idea has survived the test of time, it's much more valuable than the intellectual idea that I just came up with 10 minutes ago, haven't told anybody, and hasn't gone up against, you know, all of the kind of rebuttals. So
what's your favorite, what would you say would be a most impactful biography that you've come across?
I don't think it was those Greek or Roman biographies because they were very far away. I think that probably one of the most impactful ones that I can remember recently is around Vanderbilt. And so Vanderbilt was this guy who basically, without that much of an education, he would invent or work with people to make these steamboats. And then he had a lot of acumen around creating certain monopolies, regardless of, you know, what was right or wasn't right. And then fascinatingly enough, it all hinged on like a Supreme Court case that decided if monopolies were acceptable in the form of state-created monopolies or not. Mm-hmm. And if they were, you know, if it was deemed that state-created monopolies were acceptable, he would have had a huge problem, this guy. But it was deemed that state-created monopolies through these licenses for steamboat routes was not acceptable. And that did two interesting things. It unseated some kind of old-time landed gentry in the Americas in like the 1830s and 40s. And it, you know, basically made him right, and he saw it before other people. Mm-hmm. So I think I think Vanderbilt was a very interesting personality. First of all the biographies that I read, is somebody who really took the situation in hand and kind of took action to achieve an outcome, which I think was an amazing result. The fascinating thing, by the way, is or amazing way of looking at things. The fascinating thing, by the way, is that the ferries now in New York Harbor are all run as a public good. So the fascinating thing is that the guy he focused on an industry and he worked on something that was so important that it ended up becoming a public good. And I think that's an interesting conception of how to look at this industry. I think there's a lot of economics dynamics around this industry, but I think I might have said this. I might have said this somewhere else before. But really, the success of someone in this industry is whether they're able to make a Linux or HTTP or an HTTPS-like system that lives on for a very long time and is essentially a kind of public good.
The success of an idea, even if that idea is originally sort of a capitalist idea that's grounded in financial benefit, success of it is if it becomes a public good. It is so universal. It is so fundamental to the quality of life that it's a public good. It is deemed to be so valuable that it should be a public good.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a pretty good definition of success, that you work on a body of work, and that body of work isn't just some commercial enterprise. It's a body of work that, whatever commercial aspects or economic incentive aspects it might have, it eventually is so important that it becomes critical to how society functions. I'm personally quite lucky and grateful to be, in my opinion, working on something like that, with an amazing team and an amazing community that seems to really very much care about this hybrid smart contract, transparent world that, a lot of people in our industry, realistically, I think this is why a lot of them signed up. This is why I came into our industry. It wasn't because Bitcoin, it was because Bitcoin was a picture of how the world could work in so many other ways. And that picture of how the world could work in so many other ways attracted me a very long time ago. And I think that all of this stuff will eventually become a public good. I think it'll become so critical to how societies function internally and internationally that just like there are systems, like the Federal Reserve, like global payment systems, like all these types of things, I think eventually all of this technology will be baked into these societally critical systems. And if I and our community and the people I work with and the body of work that we're working on can make some kind of contribution to that shift towards a fair, economically fair, transparent society, from my point of view, it's a very, very worthwhile body of work. In terms of the show, you also mentioned the show. One of the shows that I really seem to like more and more for some reason is Star Trek. Not the old Star Trek. I don't really get the old Star Trek. The special effects aren't good enough. Star Trek, like The Next Generation and Voyager and Deep Space Nine and all those. I think whenever I happen to watch a Star Trek show again, I have a very simple conception in my mind that I really didn't have whenever I saw it way back when. It's that this is what the world looks like if technology takes us towards a utopia, right? So I think there's this fascinating thing where technology can take us towards a utopia or towards a dystopia. And in my mind, those kind of 3 Star Trek shows are a picture of what human civilization looks like if everybody's technological ambitions successfully take us towards a utopia, right? Because in the Star Trek universe, you're not seeking money, or you're not seeking safety, or you're not seeking... You're not really seeking anything for yourself. Everybody, within Maslow's hierarchy of needs has gotten so many things for themselves that their goal is learning and discovering and or helping. And I think there is this conception of human life once the baser needs are satisfied. And at the end of the day, I think that's what technology generally can elevate all of human civilization to, right? It can elevate us to Star Trek world, where if people want to invent, they can do that all day and nothing else. If people want to explore the stars, they can explore the stars, and they don't have to worry about economic scarcity or any number of these other conceptions. So I don't know what the most impactful on me shows have been, but for some reason recently Star Trek in the newer variant, not the most new Star Trek shows. Those shows are a little strange. The kind of middle Star Trek universe where everybody is doing something with like a very important purpose, and nobody's thinking about like, where's my paycheck or where's my whatever. They're all kind of like, we have to discover the formula to this to save the planet over there. And literally every episode you're discovering a formula to save a planet, right, of some kind, or a universe or an ecosystem or whatever. And you're looking at it, you're like, this is a pretty good place to end up. This is where we might want to end up.
So it gives you hope. I mean, it's funny that we don't we don't often think about I think it's very useful to think about positive visions of the future when we're trying to design technology. There's a lot of sort of, in public discourse, a lot of people are thinking about kind of how everything goes wrong. It's important to think about that sometimes, but in moderation, I think, because there's not enough, in my little corner of artificial intelligence world, people are very kind of fear-monger centered. There's a lot of discussions about how everything goes wrong. Important to do, but it's also really important to talk about how things can go right, because we ultimately want to guide the design of the systems we create to make things right. And I think with hope and optimism, not naiveness, but optimism, you can actually create a better world. Like, you have to think about a positive, a better world as you create, because then you can actually create it. I'm one of the people who thinks that having an optimistic view of the world is better for design and creativity than having a pessimistic one. It's hard to design when you're in fear. What about book recommendations that you could give? People love these outside of the world of crypto that maybe had an impact on your life. Fiction, like sci-fi, maybe technical, philosophical. Is there something you would recommend that people might read?
I really liked The Three Body Problem, but that's a really hackneyed recommendation. But it really made me think. And I liked the hard sci-fi, the commitment to science and science fiction. So I thought it was very clever.
Is there something that really annoys you in terms of the opposite of hard sci-fi, like that doesn't get stuff right? Movies or...
I mean, I have issues when I watch like ostensibly sci-fi or fantasy films that are not consistent about the rules for the universe that they've laid out, or where they're just impossible to comprehend, like Christopher Nolan's latest film.
Oh yeah,
you needed like a spreadsheet to understand that. Tenet, yeah. I trust that maybe he was consistent about the rules of his universe. I just did not understand it, at all.
In that sense, I really, probably one of my favorites is 2001: Space Odyssey. It's so obviously it's many decades ago, but it's quite brilliant in both its consistency and the depth of thought put into like what the technology would actually be. Not in like visually, not in kind of silly graphical ways, but in terms of function and its impact on humanity. So
right,
but that takes care. That takes a lot of work, and that takes genius actually, which is why Kubrick is regarded for what he is. Okay, so people love it when we talk about books. Is there books, maybe 3 or so, technical fiction, philosophical, that had an impact on your life and you might recommend? And for each, is there an idea or so that you take away from it?
Yes. So I've been a voracious reader all my life. And I'm always reading like 3 or 4 or 5 books at a time. And now I use Audible a lot too, and podcasts and things like that. So I think the first one that stands out to me is it's a novel, Tender as the Night by Fitzgerald. And I read it when I was much younger, but I went back and read it recently, and it's not that good. So I'm not sure why it has like such an important place in my literary history, but I love Fitzgerald as an author because he has very like flowery prose that I can just picture what he's saying, but he does it in such a creative way. I remember that one in particular because I read a ton as a kid too, but it kind of it was like the beginning of my adult reading life and getting into classics, and I do feel like they seem intimidating maybe, and then I realized that they're all just like love stories. So
Yeah, isn't everything a
you
love
know,
story?
yeah, it's really
at the bottom.
even I don't know. I was surprised that even like a lot of the Russian authors, they're all just love stories.
Wikimans are pretty simple. There's not much to work. There's not much to work with. So
I think maybe that was it. It made like that whole world less intimidating to me and cemented my love
that's cool.
for reading.
People should have just approached the classics like there's probably a love story in here.
Yeah.
So it somehow boils down to a chick flick.
Yes.
So just relax and enjoy the ride.
And then
so what else?
Changing gears quite a bit. The Beginning of Infinity. Do you know it? By David Deutsch. So he's a physicist, I think at Cambridge or Oxford. And so I was introduced like more formally to a lot of the ideas, like a lot of the things we've talked about. He has a lot more like formalism and physics rigor around. And so I got introduced to, more like jargon of how to think about some of these ideas. Like memes and, DNA as ultimate meme, the concept of infinity and objective beauty. But he has a really strong grounding in physics. And then
so he has a rigorous way of talking about these like big topics.
Yeah. So that was very mind-opening to me to read that. But it also, I think, is probably part of why I ended up marrying my husband is related to that book. And then I've had some other really great connections with people because I had read it and so had they.
I like how you turned that book, even that book, into a love story.
I did. Oh no.
Somehow.
No, it's good. It's good. Your robot has a heart.
Yeah, exactly.
And okay, the third series is it's Harry Potter.
Of course, which somehow connects to. I haven't read Harry Potter. I'm really sorry.
Oh, no.
Forgive me. But have read Tolkien, but just Harry Potter. Just haven't gotten to it. But your company name is somehow, I think, connected to Harry Potter, right? I vaguely heard this.
I always feel like I have to justify my fandom. The first 3 books came out when I was 10, so I went along this journey with Harry, age-wise, and I read them all like 9 or 10 times, all 7 books, and I think anything that just keeps you reading is what's important. And I have lulls where I don't feel like reading anything, so I'll reread a Harry Potter or a trashy detective novel or something, and I don't really care. And that's why I mention Harry Potter, because it, whatever just keeps me reading, I think is important. And it was a big part of my life growing up. And then yes, Axion, the official story of the naming of the company is that Axion is like a concatenation of accelerate and ion, but it actually came from Accio, the summoning charm, and then we just added an N, and it was perfect.
What's the summoning charm? It's one of the spells.
It probably most notably, Harry uses it to summon his broomstick out of his dorm room when he's battling a dragon somewhere else. So he says the spell, and the broomstick comes to him. So summoning in that way. Okay, there we go.
This is brilliant. So the big thing is that it's something that you've carry with. It's like it's your safe place you return to. Something like the Harry Potter.
That I reread them still. Whatever keeps me reading, I think, is the most important thing.
Okay, I got it. So
yeah,
I'm actually the same way in terms of the habit of it. It's important. It's important to just keep reading.
Exactly.
But I have found myself struggling a little bit because I listen to a lot of audiobooks now. I've struggled to then switch back to reading seriously. Because I read so many papers, I read so many other things. It feels like if I'm going to sit down and have the time to actually focus on the reading, I should be reading like blog posts or papers or more condensed kind of things.
Yeah.
But there's a huge value to just reading long form still.
Yeah, and my husband was never that into fiction, but then someone told him or he heard. You learn a lot of empathy through reading fiction. So you could think of it that way.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what. Yeah. And it's also fiction is a nice, unlike not less so with nonfiction, is a chance to travel. I see it as kind of traveling.
Yeah,
as you go to this other world, and it's nice because it's like much more efficient. You don't have to get on a plane. You don't have to, and you get to meet all kinds of new people. It's like people say they love traveling. And I say I love traveling too. I just, read fiction.
I told my 3-year-old that was why we read so much, because we, see the places in our mind. And I'm like, it's basically like we're watching a movie. That's how it feels. And she's like, I prefer watching Frozen with popcorn, was her response to that. Like, well, you're 3.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
But there's some power to the imagination, right? It's not just like watching a movie, because something about our imagination, because it's the words in the world that's painted somehow mixing in with our own understanding of our own hopes and dreams, our fears. It like mixes up in there in the way we can build up that world from just the page. So.
Yeah, you're really creating the world just with the prompts from the book, right? Yeah, that's different than watching a movie.
Yeah, which is why it hurts sometimes to watch the movie version, and then you're like, "That's
true.
not at all how I imagined it." Well, we kind of brought this up in terms of depending on what the goals are. Okay, so we mentioned Camus.
Oh yeah, love him.
Is there this is a question that people love when I ask of really smart people. What is love? No. What books? Let's say 3 books, if you can think of them. Technical, fiction, philosophical. Would you had a big impact on you, or would you recommend to others?
Sure. The Machiavellians by James Burnham. This is a book about how politics works in reality as opposed to how people imagine it working. Mencius Moldbug, who's a figure in these circles who's respected by a lot of people. I was giving a talk and there was a bunch of panelists and we were asked, what book would you recommend? I said The Machiavellians. Independently of me, that was the book he had recommended. It's out of print. It's hard to find, but that would be one.
Is that his book or no?
James Burnham. It came out in 1941, I think.
So can you pause on the Mencius? What's
Mencius Moldbug.
That's a code name, right? That guy's pen
Curtis Yarvin is his real name. He swims in your circles.
Which circles?
He does some kind of programming.
Oh, he's originally programmed. Yeah. He comes up as a person that I should talk with or I should know about. But then I read a few of his things and they seem quite dangerous.
They're very long and verbose, but I think he's an amazing thinker.
Yeah,
but he's the one who had the idea of sending the tanks to Harvard Yard.
But doesn't he have he has some radical views. I forget what they are.
Radical views. Yeah, he wants a military coup.
But you're saying he's a serious thinker that is worthy of, not worthy.
I don't know that you would enjoy having a conversation with him. I think a lot of people enjoy seeing it happen, but I think it would be a lot of talking past each other and it would be interesting.
What do you agree?
I did a stream with him.
What do you disagree? Okay. What do you agree? What do you disagree with?
I agree with him that politics has to be looked at objectively and without kind of an emotional connection to different schools. I talk about him a lot in my book on the New Right. Disagree. I don't think a military coup is a good idea. He doesn't think anarchism is stable. I disagree. I mean, me and him, I did a live stream with him. We just dorked out a lot about history and people who've fallen in the memory hole. So, I mean, he's got a lot of writing. So
the sense I got from him was that if I talk with him, a lot of people would be upset with me for giving him a platform.
Yeah, I think he's on that edge where they want to read him out of what is acceptable discourse.
What's his most controversial? I mean, you keep mentioning the tanks. Is that the most controversial viewpoint? Does he have a race thing?
No, he's the alt-right doesn't particularly like him in many ways because he's not a big on the race thing. I don't know what would be his most controversial view, to be honest. I think because he is radical in terms of his analysis of culture, anytime someone's a radical, that is dangerous.
Yeah, it's dangerous. Okay, book. So that's one.
The Fountainhead. The Fountainhead. which is I would say
not Atlas Shrugged.
No, if you read Atlas Shrugged before reading The Fountainhead, you're doing yourself an enormous disservice. Don't you dare do it.
On the philosophical, because
every
the
level,
novel
on every level. Fountainhead's a better novel. Fountainhead's superfluous if you read Atlas Shrugged first. Fountainhead's about psychology and ethics. It does not have to do with her politics, other than its implications. So it's by far the superior book. The third one. Ooh, this is a good one question. Let me see. There's so many good books out there that I love. I'm going to. This is not really my third choice, but I'll throw it out there because this is such an important worldview, especially for people on the right.
Are you virtue signaling?
No, this is counter signaling. Thaddeus Russell's book, A Renegade History of the United States. His thesis is that it's the degenerates that give us all freedom. And things like prostitutes, things like madams, things like slaves, things like immigrants, because they were so low status, they could get away with things that then people who are higher status demanded, and so on and so forth. So I think that thesis, and it really has extreme consequences in thinking. And Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind. Those are the four.
Is that his best? I haven't read any of his stuff.
The Righteous Mind is the only one you want.
Okay. That was 4, but of course.
Forget Thaddeus Russell. We'll put Haidt in there.
Of course you would.
No, forget Thaddeus. Those are the 3.